I rented a small cabin in northern Idaho for a week in late October. It was one of those places listed as off-grid, way out from town, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and running on propane and a backup generator. I had been burned out from work for a long time, and this trip was supposed to help me reset. My plan was simple: read, hike, cook, sleep, repeat. I packed groceries for the week, brought a couple of paperbacks, and even left my laptop at home. I wanted to disappear for a bit. The drive took about 4 hours from Spokane. The last hour was on a gravel forest road that wound deep through thick pines and steep hillsides. The trees started closing in the farther I drove, and I noticed I hadn't passed another vehicle in over 30 miles. No tire tracks either. The gravel road was uneven, and at points I had to slow to 5 miles an hour to avoid bottoming out my car. The cabin finally appeared after a steep climb around a rocky curve. It sat in a narrow clearing that looked like it had been manually cut from the forest years ago. One side dropped sharply into a ravine full of thick underbrush. The other side rose up into steep forest hills. The trees were tall, thick-trunked, and pressed close on all sides except a small patch out front where someone had left a couple of chopped logs and a rusted-out fire ring. The place looked decent from the outside. Rough wooden walls, metal roof, single story, and a front porch with a sagging railing. There was a little storage shed off to the side that was padlocked. The keys to the cabin were under a rock beside the steps, just like the email had said. I let myself in. It smelled faintly like old wood and dust, but not unpleasant. There was a propane fridge and stove, a wood stove in the corner for heat, and a small bathroom that used a compost toilet and a gravity-fed shower tank you had to fill with creek water. I unpacked and got settled. That first night was quiet. I read until it got too dark to see and then cooked pasta on the propane stove. It was cold, but not unbearable, and the wood stove heated the cabin fast once I got a fire going. The bed was a foam mattress on a wooden platform. I fell asleep with the sound of wind in the trees and small animal noises outside. The next morning, I took a walk down to the creek. It wasn't far, just a few hundred yards through the woods. The water was shallow and clear, running over rocks and fallen branches. I filled 2 big jugs with water, walked back up to the cabin, and poured them into the shower tank. I heated a little on the stove to take the chill off and poured that in too. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Afterward, I cooked eggs, sat on the porch for a while, and just listened to the trees move. The first 2 days went by like that. Peaceful, quiet, easy. On the 3rd morning, I woke up feeling like something was different. I couldn't place it at first. The fire in the stove had died during the night, so it was cold inside. I put on a jacket and went out to grab more wood. As I stepped off the porch, I saw something odd in the dirt near the woodpile. It was a footprint, not mine. It was a single boot print in the soft dirt, pointing toward the porch. It looked fresher than anything else on the ground. I knelt down and looked closer. It had rained a bit the day before, and the dirt had dried slightly overnight, but the edges of the print were still sharp. I looked around and didn't see any others, just the one. At first, I thought maybe I'd made it myself and just didn't remember. I even checked the tread on my boots, but it didn't match. Mine had thick square lugs. The print had small triangles in the heel and toe. I stood there for a long time trying to think through it. Maybe a hunter or hiker had passed by, but it would have been weird for them to walk up to the cabin without leaving more prints. And we were miles from any trail. I spent most of that day feeling unsettled. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood and walking around the edge of the clearing, but I kept glancing at the trees. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I didn't feel alone either. That night, I locked the door and pushed a chair under the knob. I had brought a small hatchet with me and left it beside the bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing again. I looked for more prints but didn't find any. I convinced myself it was nothing. I even told myself maybe it was left there days ago by whoever maintained the place. But then I found something else. Near the edge of the ravine, about 50 feet from the cabin, there was a cigarette butt, half buried in pine needles. It hadn't rained again since that first time, so I figured it had to be recent. It was crushed, but not old. The paper was only slightly yellowed. I don't smoke. Nobody should have been out here. It wasn't hunting season yet, and there were no trail markers or signs that anyone used this area regularly. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I felt something hard settle in my stomach. I went back to the cabin and started locking everything up more tightly. I even dragged the heavy wood box in front of the door at night. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, like a twig snapping. Then another. I sat up in bed and didn't move. I could hear wind in the trees and something softer. Slow footsteps moving through dry needles. It sounded like they were circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe hard. The footsteps would stop, then start again a few minutes later. At one point, I heard something thud lightly against the side wall. I got out of bed slowly, picked up the hatchet and stood in the dark. My heart was hammering in my chest. I waited for maybe an hour without hearing anything else. Finally, I crawled back into bed and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. In the morning, I found 2 things. First, there were boot prints near the corner of the cabin, same pattern as before. The second thing was worse. About 20 feet into the trees, facing the cabin, I found a little pile of branches. Someone had broken them and stacked them together. On top of the pile was a piece of bread. Just a slice of bread, laid flat on top of the sticks like an offering. That broke something in my brain. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt deliberate and strange in a way I couldn't explain. Why would someone do that? I didn't have cell service, but I started packing anyway. I got everything into my car by mid-afternoon and turned the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I checked the battery cables. They looked fine. I popped the hood and couldn't find anything wrong. I had driven it just 3 days ago, and it had run perfectly. I tried again. Nothing. I went back to the cabin to think. I didn't want to walk 10 miles back to the main road unless I had to. I had enough food and water to last. Maybe I'd just wait until morning and try again. Maybe it was a fluke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had done something to it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed by the window with the hatchet and a flashlight. Around 2 a.m. again, I heard the sound. Not footsteps this time, more like soft breathing. Close. I turned off my light and listened. It was just outside the window. I didn't look. Couldn't. I was too afraid that I'd see someone looking back. The sound went on for a few minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited for light. When morning came, I went outside with the hatchet in hand. I walked around the cabin and saw nothing. But when I looked up at the ridge above the clearing, the one covered in pine trees, I saw something that made me freeze. A man. He was standing just inside the tree line, about 100 yards up the slope. He wasn't moving, wasn't walking, just standing there, watching. He was wearing a jacket and dark pants. I couldn't see his face. When I blinked, he was gone. I scanned the ridge for 5 minutes and saw no movement. I ran back inside, slammed the door, and started writing a note. I left it on the table. It said who I was, where I had gone, and that someone had been watching me. Then I packed a small bag, filled my water bottles, and started walking down the gravel road. I walked fast. It was about 9 or 10 miles to where the Forest Service road met the highway. I didn't stop. I kept checking over my shoulder. The whole time, I felt like someone was in the trees, walking just out of sight. I didn't see him again. After 6 hours, I finally reached the highway. A truck driver pulled over after 30 minutes of waiting and gave me a ride to the nearest gas station. From there, I called a tow company, and we drove back up to the cabin the next day. When we got there, the tow guy got out first. He went to check the car battery. I walked over to the porch. My note was gone. The door was still locked, but when I opened it, I saw something else. The slice of bread was on the table, right where I had left my note. That was it. I didn't even bother gathering the rest of my stuff. I told the tow guy we were done. I had him tow my car to town and never went back. I reported it to the sheriff, but they said no laws were broken. No damage to property, no physical contact, no crime. They didn't seem to care about the bread. For weeks after I got home, I kept looking out my window at night. Sometimes I thought I saw something in the trees. A figure, watching. but I never saw him again. I don't usually talk about this part of my life, not because I'm trying to hide it, but because it doesn't really come up. Most people just want to hear the good stuff. They want to know about the hiking trails, the peaceful lakes, or the quiet nights out in the wilderness where you can finally hear your own heartbeat. But there was one trip that I think about often, one I'll never forget, even though I wish I could. This happened in early November a few years ago. The leaves had already turned and most had fallen. The air had that cold bite in the mornings and evenings, and the sun felt weaker than usual. I had rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota, not far from the edge of Superior National Forest. It was remote enough to be quiet, but still reachable by a dirt road if you drove slow. I wasn't trying to go off the grid or anything. I just needed time away from people, work, noise, everything. I wasn't depressed, not really, just tired, burned out. I wanted to sleep in, make my own meals, read some old paperbacks, maybe do some walking or fishing if the weather held up. The cabin was small, one room with a bathroom off to the side and a tiny kitchen built into one wall. There was a couch, a coffee table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. A full-sized bed sat near the back window with a faded quilt and 2 pillows that didn't match. The windows didn't have blinds, just light curtains, which I didn't really care about. I was surrounded by trees in every direction. Nobody could see in unless they were standing on the porch or walking through the woods, and I figured the odds of that were low. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no landline. That was on purpose. I brought some groceries, plenty of bottled water, a few flashlights, batteries, a book of matches, and some firewood. I also brought a small cooler with ice packs for the stuff that needed to stay cold. I was planning to be there 5 nights. I figured by the end of that I'd either be rested or bored out of my mind. But either way, I'd be ready to go back. The first day was exactly what I wanted. I made scrambled eggs on a little camp stove, then sat on the porch drinking coffee while the sun came up through the bare trees. It was quiet, so quiet it felt like the world had been put on pause. The only thing I heard was wind moving through dead leaves and the occasional snap of a branch off in the woods. I read most of the day, took a nap, made a simple dinner, and went to bed early. Felt peaceful. The second day was similar, but I started to notice just how alone I was. The silence that had felt calming the day before now seemed heavy, like a thick blanket pressed over my ears. There were moments I would stop and listen, just to see if I could hear anything at all. I don't know what I expected, maybe a plane overhead or the distant sound of a truck. But there was nothing, total quiet. I didn't realize how used to background noise I was until I didn't have any. It made me a little jumpy. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. I wasn't cold, and there was no sound. I just sat up in bed, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I stayed still, listening. Nothing, not even wind. I got up and went to the bathroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and stood there staring at myself in the mirror, wondering why I felt nervous. It was just a cabin in the woods. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep again. The third day started cloudy and gray. It looked like it might snow. I made oatmeal and sat by the stove, flipping through an old mystery novel. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was getting low on firewood. There was more stacked under a tarp behind the cabin, so I put on a jacket and went out to get some. As I walked around the back, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the side of the building. At first I figured they were mine from the day I arrived, but these were different. They came from the woods, curved along the side of the cabin, then stopped right below one of the windows. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different. A deeper boot print, wider than mine with a thicker sole. I followed the prints with my eyes. They didn't come back the way they had come. They just stopped at the window. No return path. It was like someone walked up to the cabin, looked in the window, then vanished. My first thought was maybe a hunter or some other cabin owner nearby walking through the woods. But why stop at my window? And why not knock? I looked around. Nothing. Just trees and wet leaves and bare branches. I walked over to the edge of the woods and stared into the trees, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching. There was no one. I carried the wood inside and tried to forget about it. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe someone got lost, walked up, looked in to see if the cabin was occupied, then turned back into the woods. Still, I didn't like it. I kept checking the windows that afternoon, pulling the curtains shut even though I'd left them open the previous 2 nights. It was stupid, maybe, but I didn't like the idea of someone watching me without me knowing. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things, small sounds, probably nothing, but enough to keep me half awake. A creak on the porch, the shift of tree branches. I stared at the ceiling for hours. At some point, I dozed off, and that's when I had the dream. In the dream, I was lying in bed, just like I was in real life. I felt cold, even though the stove was going. I opened my eyes and saw a face looking at me through the window beside the bed. It was just a shape, really, but I could tell it was a man. I couldn't see his features clearly, just dark eyes and a long, pale face staring in. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I just lay there frozen, staring back. Then he smiled, the kind of slow, deliberate smile that makes your skin crawl. I woke up sweating. I got out of bed and went to the window. There was nothing there. No face, no marks on the glass. I checked the other windows too. All clear. But when I opened the front door to check the porch, I found something that hadn't been there before. A single, smooth stone, about the size of a golf ball, placed right in the center of the doormat. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even seen it earlier that day when I went out for firewood. It hadn't rained or snowed, so there was no reason it would have just appeared. It was clean. Too clean, like it had been rinsed off before being set there. I left it alone and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That day, I stayed indoors. I kept the stove burning, didn't go near the windows, and didn't open the curtains. I kept checking the time, waiting for night to fall like it was some kind of test I had to pass. My ears were tuned to every sound. A squirrel scurrying across the roof sounded like footsteps. Wind against the siding sounded like breathing. I was on edge the entire day. When it got dark, I left a flashlight beside my bed and kept a long-handled fire poker within reach. I didn't expect to use it, but it made me feel better. I barely slept. The 5th day, the last full day I was supposed to be there, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I was jittery, exhausted, and sick of being inside. I decided to walk down to the lake. It was about a 1/4 mile through the woods behind the cabin. There was no real trail, just a general direction you had to follow. But I'd done it once on the first day and knew the way. I bundled up and headed out, hoping the cold air would clear my head. The lake was quiet. Still, the surface had started to freeze around the edges, and patches of thin ice crunched underfoot as I got closer. I sat on a flat rock near the water and stared out across the gray surface. No animals, no people, no birds. I sat there for a while, until I started to feel like I was being watched again. I stood up and looked behind me. Nothing moved, just empty woods. I started back toward the cabin, and that's when I saw something. About 50 feet off the path, there was a shape leaning against a tree. At first I thought it was a stump or maybe some old gear someone left behind. But the longer I stared, the more it looked like a person, standing still, watching. I didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The shape didn't move either. Then it turned. Just a slight shift, but enough to make it clear. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see his face. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there. I turned and walked as calmly as I could back toward the cabin. I didn't run. I didn't want to. I didn't want to give him a reason to follow. When I got back, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat down at the kitchen table. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't want to know if he was still there. That night, the power went out. I hadn't even been using it much, just a few lights and a small heater to supplement the stove. But around 9 p.m., everything clicked off. I lit a candle and sat by the stove, listening. At 11:13 p.m., I looked at the window near the bed. There was a handprint on the glass. Not smudged, not old, fresh, moist, like someone had pressed their palm flat against it and then pulled away just minutes before. I stared at it, my heart racing. I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. I sat in the armchair by the stove, poker in my lap, listening to every sound. At one point, I heard the floorboards on the porch creak, just once, then silence. I waited like that until morning. As soon as I drove 7 hours straight that morning. The last stretch of road was just a dirt path full of potholes, twisting up through tall pines. My back ached. My right leg felt stiff. And even though the air was cooler up here in the hills, my shirt had stuck to my back with sweat. I turned off my phone an hour ago. There wasn't any signal here anyway, and that was the whole point. I'd been working on a research project for months, something I needed time and space to really finish. I thought a week alone in a cabin would clear my head and let me focus. I rented the cabin online. It was small and old, built sometime in the 70s maybe, but it looked clean in the pictures. No frills, just a wood stove, a table, a bed, a bathroom, and a desk next to a window. It sat near the bottom edge of a sloping ridge, surrounded by nothing but trees. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down a muddy road. That was fine with me. I didn't want to hear anyone's music through the walls. I didn't want to hear cars or traffic or voices. I just wanted silence. I needed it. When I arrived, it was already past 4. The air smelled like pine sap and damp leaves. The cabin sat tucked into a pocket of trees, low and quiet, with moss climbing up one side of the foundation. It looked a little smaller than it had in the photos. The paint on the door was faded, and the window screens had tiny holes along the edges. Still, it looked dry and solid. The key was in a little metal box under the porch, just like the owner said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly like dust and cedar. I dropped my bags by the table and walked through every corner of the place. There was only one room really besides the bathroom. The bed was pushed against the far wall with a thin gray blanket folded across it. The bathroom had a narrow sink, a tiny mirror, and a small shower with a curtain that didn't reach the floor. The wood stove in the main room was rusted in spots but looked usable. The windows were all shut tight. I liked that. After bringing in the rest of my stuff from the car, I set up my laptop on the desk. I plugged it in and checked the battery bank I brought. Fully charged. I wouldn't have power from the grid out here, but I had enough batteries and a small solar panel on the roof for backup. I didn't want to write by candlelight, so I checked the lanterns too. I brought 2 LED ones that could last for days. I spent the first night unpacking, organizing my papers, and making something simple to eat. I kept glancing at the woods through the windows. The trees out here were tall and tight. The shadows between them grew darker quickly, and by 6:30, it looked like midnight outside. There was no moon that night, just stars and black. I went to bed around 10. The silence was almost too much. I could hear my own heartbeat in the stillness. Every small creak in the walls sounded louder than it should have. It took me a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I got up early. I brewed instant coffee and sat down at the desk. I started typing right away. Felt good. No distractions. No texts. No emails. Just me and the work. That whole day passed without anything strange. I took a short walk in the afternoon just to get the blood moving, then went back to writing. That night I ate, cleaned up, and slept better than I had in weeks. The third day, I worked straight through the morning, barely looking up. But around noon, something made me pause. I noticed movement outside the window, just a flicker, a shift in the shadows. I stood up slowly and looked out. There was nothing, just trees, a few leaves blowing. I stood there for a while, eyes scanning the tree line. Then I went back to work. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something had moved. Later that afternoon, I went out for another walk. I followed the same trail I had the day before, a narrow dirt path that cut behind the cabin and curved uphill. After about half a mile, it branched in two. I took the left fork this time. The forest there felt tighter. The trees grew so close together that in some places you had to duck. The light was dim even though the sun was still up. I walked for about 10 minutes before turning around. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A small pile of pebbles had been placed near the front step. It was neat, like someone had stacked them carefully. 5 stones, flat and gray, arranged in a little tower. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't remember seeing it there when I left. I bent down and touched it. The rocks were cool. Not wet, not warm, just normal. I knocked them over without thinking and went inside. That night, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut across the window. I kept hearing small sounds outside. Not loud, not constant, just once in a while. A soft crack, a faint snap. I told myself it was squirrels, or maybe deer. Still, I kept one of the lanterns on. The fourth day, I got less writing done. I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I found myself looking toward the window. Around noon, I stepped outside to stretch. I walked around the back of the cabin, where the trees pressed close. That's when I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were boot prints, fresh ones, in the soft dirt behind the house. Not mine. These were bigger, wider. They circled around the back corner and stopped just a few feet from the window. I stood frozen, staring down at the prints. My skin prickled. I hadn't heard anyone. I hadn't seen anyone. I crouched down and looked closer. The tread was deep, probably made sometime that morning. I looked around at the woods, but everything was still. I took a slow step backward, then another. Then I turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. That afternoon, I didn't go for a walk. I stayed inside and kept the lanterns ready. I kept the windows shut. I even pulled the desk away from the window so no one could see me sitting there from outside. I tried to work, but my thoughts kept drifting. I kept imagining someone standing in the woods, just out of sight, watching, waiting. By the time evening came, I was tense. My shoulders ached from staying hunched all day. I ate a small dinner, barely tasting it. Before bed, I placed a heavy chair under the doorknob. Felt stupid, but I did it anyway. I turned off the lanterns and lay in the dark, listening. Every creak sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper. Around midnight, I heard something move on the porch. Just one step, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared into the dark. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, it was morning. On the fifth day, I decided I'd had enough. I told myself I'd pack up and leave the next morning. Just one more day. I didn't want to drive down the mountain tired. I started making notes to finish my last section, just to say the trip wasn't a waste. Around noon, I stepped outside to get some air. I walked around the side of the cabin again, and my heart dropped. There was a small piece of cloth hanging from a low tree branch. It looked like a ripped bit of flannel, red and black, like someone had snagged their shirt. Below it, the leaves were crushed. Someone had stood there, maybe crouched. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took the cloth down and brought it inside. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself it was real. That afternoon, I didn't write. I packed up most of my gear just to be ready. I double-checked the battery packs, the food, everything. That night, I stayed dressed and kept the lantern on again. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move outside. Then something tapped the side of the cabin. Not loud, not hard, just a single tap. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Then I heard it again on the window glass. I didn't look. I didn't move. I sat there until the sun came up. By the sixth day, I was ready to leave. I opened the door early, dragged my bags outside, and loaded everything into the car. The morning was cold and cloudy. I walked once more around the cabin just to be sure I didn't forget anything. That's when I noticed something behind the woodpile near the back wall. A small hole had been dug into the dirt. Not big, just deep enough to hide something. I got a stick and poked at it. There was something buried there. I used my hands and cleared the dirt away. What I found made my throat tighten. It was a small camera, one of those hunting trail cameras, the kind people strap to trees to watch wildlife. This one had been placed underground with the lens just barely sticking out. It had been pointed directly at my bedroom window. I pulled it out with shaking hands. It was covered in dirt. I didn't recognize it. I didn't bring it. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. It must have been placed there after I got there. I turned it over. The battery light was still blinking. I didn't think. I just got in the car and started driving. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The tires slipped and bounced on the potholes, but I didn't care. I didn't even turn the radio on until I was halfway down the mountain. Only then did I let myself breathe. When I got back to town, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a while. I never used to think too much before booking solo trips. I liked the silence, the open space, the sense of being cut off from everything. I worked in IT, mostly remote, so I was always looking at screens and hearing message pings. A few days away in the woods always helped clear my head. That's how I ended up at this old cabin in northern Idaho, near the edge of a national forest, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I found the listing online. The pictures made it look peaceful. Just a one-story wooden cabin with a slanted roof, some overgrown grass around it, and a small fire pit in the back. The view was what really sold me. Behind the cabin, the land dipped into a small valley, then stretched out into pine-covered hills that went on for miles. I rented it for a week. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no cell signal. Just the quiet. I drove up on a Sunday morning, stopped in town for supplies, filled the tank, and headed down the gravel road that twisted through the woods. It took almost an hour after leaving the paved road to reach the cabin. The last stretch was narrow, with tree branches brushing against the sides of my car. When I finally reached the clearing, I parked beside the porch and stepped out. The air was cool and clean, full of pine smell and distant birds. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the photos. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside was plain. One bedroom, a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet, a little kitchen area with an old propane stove, and a small living space with a wood stove and a single couch. There were no decorations except a calendar from 2017 on the wall and a coat rack near the door. A few dishes were in the cupboards. Everything felt dusty and unused, but I liked it. It was quiet. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the back porch after dinner, sipping a beer and watching the sun go down behind the hills. The stars came out one by one, and with no light around, they looked sharper than I'd seen in years. I went to bed early. I slept well. On the second day, I explored the woods around the cabin. There wasn't a trail, but I didn't mind bushwhacking a bit. I hiked north, toward the ridge I'd seen in the distance. It was slow going, with fallen logs and thick undergrowth, but I made it to a spot with a clear view of the valley. I sat there for a while, listening to the wind in the trees and the far-off sound of a hawk. I didn't see any people. I didn't expect to. On my way back, I noticed a small structure through the trees, maybe 100 yards east of the cabin. It looked like an old shed, partly collapsed, covered in vines. I hadn't seen it before. I walked toward it but stopped when I saw fresh footprints in the dirt nearby. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that way yet. The prints looked recent, sharper than mine from earlier. Someone had been near my cabin. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Just the wind. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I backed away from the shed and made my way quickly back to the cabin. I locked the door when I got inside and checked all the windows. They were shut, the latches still dusty. I told myself it was probably just a hunter, maybe a hiker, maybe someone from the area. Still, I kept waking up that night, listening for sounds. I thought I heard movement outside once, twigs snapping, but when I looked, I saw nothing, just the trees. The third day, I didn't leave the clearing. I drank my coffee on the porch and watched the woods. I kept the axe beside the door, just in case. Around noon, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the trees. A dark shape between two trunks. Could have been an animal. Could have been nothing. I watched for a long time, but it didn't move again. Still, something felt wrong. Felt like I wasn't alone anymore. That afternoon, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs. I saw more footprints on the east side, near the old shed. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared in the brush. They weren't deep, just a few prints like someone had been watching and left in a hurry. I didn't go far. I felt like someone was still out there. That night, I brought a chair inside and sat by the front window. I left the lights off so I could see out. The moon was almost full, casting long shadows. Around 1 a.m., I saw something. a shape standing at the edge of the clearing. Too far to make out details, but close enough to tell it wasn't an animal. It didn't move. It just stood there. After a long time, I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I considered leaving. I packed some of my stuff, loaded the car, but I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining things. Still, I kept the axe with me when I went outside, even just to use the bathroom. I didn't wander into the woods again. On the 5th night, everything changed. I went to bed early but kept waking up. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. Not branches, not an animal. It was a slow creak, like the porch boards under weight. My heart started pounding. I reached for the axe and moved to the living room, staying low. I didn't turn on the lights. I heard the sound again, one step at a time across the porch. Then silence. I waited. I don't know how long. Then something touched the door. Not knocking, not banging, just a soft press, like someone testing it. I held my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then the doorknob turned slowly, stopped, turned again. It was locked. Whoever it was tried a few more times. Then the pressure stopped. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of footsteps. Fast. Leaving the porch and running off into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, I found boot prints on the porch. They were large, wide-set, with deep treads. Not mine. I followed them a little way, but they vanished into the grass. Whoever it was had walked off the porch and disappeared into the trees. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I wanted to see who it was. I spent that day sitting near the window with the axe in my lap. That night, he came back. This time, he didn't try the door. I was watching through the crack in the curtains when I saw him. He stepped out of the trees, wearing dark clothes, no light, nothing in his hands that I could see. He moved quietly, not walking straight to the cabin, but circling it. I watched him pass by the windows, slow and steady, like he was looking in. He came around again, this time closer. He stopped right outside the window where I was crouched, just a few feet from me. I held my breath. I could see his shape, tall, broad shoulders, maybe a hood or a cap, I couldn't tell. He just stood there, like he was listening. Then he moved on. I waited a long time before looking again. When I did, he was standing in the middle of the clearing, looking at the cabin. Just standing, not moving. I stayed still for hours. He didn't come back to the porch. He didn't try the door. But I knew then it wasn't random. He wasn't lost. He'd been watching for days. The next morning, I left. I didn't clean the place. I didn't leave a note. I just grabbed my stuff, threw it in the car, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't feel safe until I saw other cars again. When I got back to town, I told the sheriff. He took notes, said it was probably a squatter or local survivalist. Said they'd check it out. I don't know if they ever did. I never heard back. I looked up the property listing again later that week. It was still there. Same pictures. No reviews mentioning anything strange. I didn't leave one either. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to describe the way he moved. The way he stood there just watching. Like he wasn't in a hurry. Like he had all the time in the world. Sometimes I still think about it. I see the trees out my apartment window, and I remember how quiet it was. I remember the feeling that someone was just behind them, watching, waiting, like they weren't done. I haven't gone back into the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I had planned to take a break from everything for a few days. Life in the city was wearing me out. Work stress, traffic, noise, and the same routine every single day made everything feel dull and heavy. I wanted some peace and silence, just the sound of wind and leaves, nothing else. So I booked a cabin deep in the northern woods of Michigan. I found it on a small website that listed remote stays for people who didn't care much for Wi-Fi or phone service. The pictures looked nice, nothing fancy. A one-room cabin with a bed, a fireplace, a small bathroom, and a basic kitchen setup. No neighbors nearby, no power lines, no paved roads, just woods and space. I left on a Thursday morning. The weather was good, blue skies, not too cold, not too warm. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, clothes, a few basic tools, flashlight, batteries, some books, and a knife I kept in my drawer that I'd never actually used outside, just in case. The drive took longer than expected. The last hour was on a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. It was full of holes and thick mud in spots, and the trees got so close to the path that my side mirrors brushed against branches a few times. I started wondering if this was really worth it. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows in the woods got longer and darker. I hadn't seen another car or person in over an hour. Eventually, I reached a small clearing with a narrow driveway that led to the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures: small, simple, and quiet. I got out and stretched my legs. The air smelled like pine and earth. It felt still, like the trees were holding their breath. There were no sounds, no birds, no bugs, nothing. That kind of silence is rare, and it felt nice at first. I brought my bags inside, lit a couple of candles, and set up my stuff. The cabin didn't have electricity, so everything was either candlelit or battery-powered. I made a simple meal, canned soup, and sat by the small window eating while the last bit of light faded outside. The woods around the cabin grew darker by the second. I didn't mind. That was the whole point, getting away from lights and noise. That first night, I didn't sleep much. The silence, which I had craved so badly, now felt a little too thick. Every creak of the wooden walls, every rustle of wind through the trees, sounded louder than it should. I kept telling myself I was just not used to it. My body was still running on city time, still expecting sirens and honking cars. But lying there, under a thin blanket with the fire dying out, I started to feel like something was just off. I woke up a few times during the night. Once I thought I heard crunching outside, like footsteps in dry leaves. Another time I swore I heard something tap the window, but each time I told myself it was probably an animal. Could have been a raccoon or maybe just wind shifting the trees. I tried not to overthink it. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and looked around. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign of animals, nothing broken. I decided to shake off the nerves. I spent the morning reading, then went for a walk through the woods. I didn't have a set path, so I just wandered in a wide circle, marking a few trees along the way with a small scratch so I wouldn't get lost. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, calm and golden with sun filtering through the leaves. I came back after 2 hours and cooked lunch. Later that day, around 4 or 5 p.m., I was out gathering small branches for the fireplace when I noticed something strange. About 20 yards from the cabin, hidden behind some thick shrubs, was a trail I hadn't seen earlier. It was very narrow and almost overgrown. Something about it looked old, like it hadn't been used in a long time. But there were signs that someone had walked it recently. A few broken branches, flattened patches in the grass. It caught my attention. I stood there looking down that trail for a while. I don't know what made me uneasy about it. It wasn't the path itself, it was just a trail. But something about how quiet everything was around it felt wrong. Like the forest was still, waiting. I decided not to follow it, at least not yet. I went back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just noise. I felt like something was different. I got up, turned on my flashlight, and checked around the cabin. The windows were shut, the door was locked, nothing out of place. But when I stepped outside and swept the flashlight across the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the dirt. Human ones, clear as day. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the soft earth right outside the front steps. They led around the cabin, like someone had been circling it. I followed them slowly. They stopped near the back wall. There, just under the window, was a torn piece of what looked like black cloth stuck in the bark of a tree. It looked like it had been ripped off while someone brushed against it. I didn't touch it. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the chair with my flashlight and knife. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't relax. I didn't fall asleep until it was almost morning. When the sun rose, I checked again. The footprints were still there, but no new ones. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone came looking for shelter. But why wouldn't they knock? Why just circle and leave? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the knife with me and locked the door every time I went in. Around noon, I finally got curious enough to check that hidden trail I'd seen the day before. I marked the starting point with a rock and followed it slowly. The trail went deeper into the woods, winding and narrow. It seemed to go on forever. About half a mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. There was another cabin. It was older, more broken down. The roof sagged, and parts of the wall were missing. It looked abandoned, but not long abandoned. I could see signs that someone had been there recently. Ashes in a fire pit, a broken chair near the door, and footprints in the dirt. I didn't go inside. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling that same weight in my chest again. Something about the place felt wrong. I turned and went back to my cabin, marking the trail even more carefully this time. Once inside, I tried to calm down. Maybe someone else had rented that place before. Maybe it was just another forgotten listing, and someone still stayed there sometimes. I kept trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't explain the footprints around my cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat near the fireplace with a flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft thud against the side of the cabin. Then another. I froze. I didn't move. I just listened. Then something scraped against the wall. A slow dragging sound, like fingernails across wood. I stood up, holding my breath, and stepped toward the window. I moved the curtain slowly and aimed the flashlight outside. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But I didn't imagine it. Something had been out there. I stayed up until dawn again. The next morning, I decided I was done. I packed everything quickly. I didn't eat, didn't shower. I just threw my stuff in the car and started driving. I didn't even stop to check the back of the cabin again. The dirt road felt longer this time. Every shadow between the trees made me glance over my shoulder. I made it back to the highway by mid-morning. Once I had phone service again, I checked the listing on the rental site. It was gone. Not just booked, gone. Like it had never been there. I emailed the site asking about it. They replied 2 days later saying they had no record of that cabin ever being listed. I sent them the email confirmation I had, the pictures, everything. They never replied after that. I still don't know who walked around my cabin. I don't know who or what was staying in that second one. Maybe it was just someone living off-grid. Someone who didn't like visitors. Maybe I was never supposed to find that place. I don't know. What I do know is that I'll never go back into the woods alone again. That trip was supposed to be about peace. But all it did was remind me how easily you can disappear out there. How far away help really is. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't hear whispers in the trees. But I saw footprints that weren't mine. I heard footsteps outside my window. And I felt someone or something watching me from just out of sight. And that's enough. Because the scariest things don't have to be made up. Sometimes they're just real. And they don't want to be found. It started because I wanted a break. I'd been working nonstop for nearly 3 years without a proper vacation. Long hours at a marketing firm in the middle of a noisy city had worn me down more than I realized. I was exhausted in a way that didn't just come from lack of sleep. It felt deeper than that. I didn't want beaches or spas. I didn't want other people. I wanted isolation. I wanted silence. I wanted to sit in a place where I couldn't hear sirens or car horns or footsteps on the ceiling above my apartment. So I found this listing online for a cabin way out in the northern woods of Michigan. It wasn't on Airbnb. It was on a smaller, independent site that listed private vacation rentals. The pictures were stunning. A single-story wooden cabin, dark brown with a tin roof, nestled between thick evergreens. It sat next to a small lake that looked almost black from the tree shadows. The nearest town was over 45 minutes away. It didn't even have Wi-Fi, no cell service, no cable, just a bed, a fireplace, a kitchen, and some books on a shelf. That's what the ad said. Unplug, heal, think. That was all I wanted. I booked it for a week, September 14th through 21st, 2022. I planned to take my laptop, not to work but to journal. Maybe right, maybe not. I packed some basic groceries, lots of dry stuff, water bottles, extra layers. I drove up from Chicago in my old Subaru, and it took nearly 7 hours. The last hour was on unpaved roads that wound through deep forest. I didn't see a single other car once I turned off the highway. Just trees and dirt roads and sunlight flashing through the gaps in the branches. The directions said to look for a metal gate with red tape wrapped around one of the posts. I almost missed it. It was just a narrow gap in the trees. The driveway was more like a trail. Deep ruts, soft dirt, leaves crunching under my tires. It was maybe half a mile long. Then it opened up into a clearing, and there was the cabin. It looked just like the photos, small but solid. There was a porch with 2 wooden chairs. A little dock out on the lake, only a few steps from the cabin. Everything was surrounded by dense trees. It was beautiful. I unpacked slowly. The inside of the cabin was plain but clean. Wood floors, wood walls, a big stone fireplace, and an old leather couch. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom with a small bed, a side table, and a closet. The kitchen had an old gas stove, a small fridge that ran on propane, and open shelves with pots and dishes. I checked out the bathroom, small, with a compost toilet and a tiny shower stall. The water came from a well. No light switches, just oil lamps and flashlights. By the time I got settled in, it was almost sunset. I stood on the little dock, watching the orange light stretch across the lake. It was totally quiet. No wind, no birds, not even bugs, just stillness. It was so peaceful that it made me feel kind of small, like I didn't matter at all in this place. I ate a cold dinner, canned beans and crackers, lit an oil lamp, and read for a bit. Then I crawled into bed and fell asleep fast. The first 2 days were perfect. I woke up with the sun and walked the edge of the lake, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in boots. The water was freezing, but the air was crisp and fresh. I read for hours. I made simple meals. I wrote long entries in a journal I hadn't touched in years. I didn't miss my phone. I didn't think about work. I felt like something heavy was slowly leaking out of me. But on the 3rd day, things started to feel a little different. Not dangerous, not yet. Just off. It began with noises. Not animal noises, something else. I woke up at around 2:30 in the morning because I thought I heard footsteps outside. I laid in bed for a minute, holding my breath. I told myself it was just branches dropping from the trees or a raccoon. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps, soft but heavy, on the dry leaves. They circled the cabin once. Then nothing. I didn't get up. I didn't even move. I just laid there until I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went out and looked around. I didn't see anything weird. No tracks, no damage. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I reminded myself how deep I was into the woods. It's easy to start imagining things when you're alone for too long. But that night, it happened again. This time, I thought I heard something brush against the front door. Just once. A soft scraping sound. Then silence. I got up and checked the window, but I couldn't see much with the oil lamp behind me. I thought about opening the door, but couldn't make myself do it. I just stood there for a while, then went back to bed. By the 5th day, I wasn't sleeping well. I'd wake up multiple times a night, convinced that someone, or something, was walking around the cabin. But every morning it was the same. Nothing outside, no signs of anyone. I told myself it was the forest. Old wood creaks, animals dig through leaves. I wanted it to be that. But then something changed. That night, I locked the door like always, blew out the lamp, and laid in bed trying to ignore the nerves crawling up my spine. I must have drifted off at some point, but around 3 a.m., I woke up to something sharp. Not a sound, a smell. It was the smell of smoke. I bolted up and ran into the living room. The fireplace was cold and used since the first night. I sniffed around. The air was smoky, but not thick. I looked at the kitchen. That's when I saw it. The back door was open. Not wide open, just an inch or two. Enough for a cold draft to be coming in. Enough to scare the hell out of me. I ran over and slammed it shut, locking it tight. I checked the front door too, still locked. Then I looked around the cabin again. Nothing was stolen. Nothing moved. Just that smell in the air and the open door. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the couch with a flashlight in my hand, staring at the door until morning. When the sun came up, I packed. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I was done. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to be stubborn about it. I shoved everything into my bags, locked up the cabin, and got in the car. But the car wouldn't start. I turned the key and heard a loud clicking sound. Then nothing. I tried again. Same thing. I opened the hood and looked inside, but I didn't know what I was doing. Everything looked fine. The battery cables were tight. No leaks, but it just wouldn't start. I sat in the front seat for a while, sweating. The air was cold, but my neck was damp. I didn't know what to do. No cell service. No landline. No neighbors. I was stuck. I thought about walking to the main road, but it was nearly 6 miles of forest trail. I didn't feel safe doing that, not with whatever was going on. So I went back inside, locked both doors again, and decided to wait until morning. Maybe it was just too cold and the car would start when the sun came up. That's what I hoped. But that night was the worst of all. I barely turned off the lamp. I sat in the chair in the living room and tried to read, but I kept looking toward the windows. I thought I saw shapes moving past them, but I couldn't be sure. I thought I heard a soft knock, just once, on the back door. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the roof. It sounded like someone walked across the entire length of it. Slow and heavy, just once. Then silence. I sat frozen, holding a kitchen knife I'd pulled from the drawer earlier. My mouth was dry. My legs were shaking. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sun came up, I ran out to the car again. I tried the key, and this time it started on the first try. I didn't stop to think about it. I drove down that dirt path as fast as I could, tires kicking up mud and leaves. When I reached the paved road, I nearly cried. I didn't stop driving until I got to a gas station an hour away. I called a friend and told him everything, or most of it. He didn't laugh. He told me I should file a report, but I didn't. I just went home. That was nearly 3 years ago. I haven't gone into the woods since. I still don't know who or what was outside that cabin. Maybe someone knew I was alone. Maybe it was just bad luck. Someone passing through. Someone curious. Maybe they didn't want to hurt me. Or maybe they did and I left just in time. Either way, I'll never go back there. I don't care how peaceful it looked in the photos. Some places are better left alone. It was early October when I decided I needed a break. I had just gone through a messy breakup. Work was draining me every single day, and everything in my life felt like it was piling up too fast. I wasn't sleeping right. My eating schedule was all over the place. Even the smallest things, like forgetting where I placed my keys, would send me into a spiral. I needed to unplug and breathe for a bit, so I found a cabin. It was in a remote area of upstate Michigan. The kind of place that didn't show up on most tourist maps. A friend of a coworker had stayed there once and told me about it. No phone signal, no internet, just a small wooden cabin beside a lake, surrounded by forest. It sounded perfect. I rented it for a week. Just me, the trees, and silence. I drove up early on a Saturday morning. It took about 6 hours from my place in Chicago, with the last hour being a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick woods. I passed no other cars, saw no houses, just trees that got taller and darker the deeper I went. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when I finally saw the cabin. It was exactly how it had looked in the photos. A small one-story structure, built of old wooden logs, with a slanted roof covered in moss. It had a little front porch with a single rocking chair and a heavy wooden door with an old latch instead of a knob. A few feet in front of the porch was the lake, calm, wide, and glassy. It stretched out to the tree line on the other side. The water reflected the orange and gold leaves above, and there wasn't a single ripple. There was no one around. No noise, no engines, no voices. Just wind and water. It was strange at first, the way it felt too quiet, like the world had turned down its volume. But I chalked it up to my city brain not being used to peace. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. One room served as the living area, with a stone fireplace, a couch, and a shelf with old books. There was a kitchen tucked in the corner, just a sink, a two-burner stove, and an old mini fridge that hummed like it was decades old. The bedroom was behind a sliding wooden door and had a twin bed, a dresser, and a small window looking out at the lake. There was also a small bathroom with a compost toilet and a crank shower. It was enough. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and went to sleep early that first night. The silence was unsettling. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something. Twigs snapping outside, a thud against the cabin wall, creaking from the roof. But I figured it was just my nerves, or maybe a raccoon. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and took it outside. The air was cold but not freezing. Mist hovered over the lake, and the sun had just started to rise. It was actually kind of beautiful. I sat there for almost an hour, watching the sun lift and the fog disappear. That's when I first noticed the tracks. They weren't close, maybe 20 feet from the cabin, near the edge of the trees. The ground there was muddy from rain earlier in the week, and something had clearly walked through it. The prints were large, larger than mine, and deep like whoever made them was heavy. I walked over to get a better look. They weren't bear prints. I had seen bear tracks before on a hiking trip last year. These looked more human than animal, just bigger. I crouched down, staring at them. 5 toes, a long arch. It was barefoot. The stride between steps was also longer than normal. I stood up and looked around the woods, suddenly feeling very watched. But there was no one there, no sound. The prints led from the trees to the side of the cabin and then back toward the woods. That was the part that bothered me. Whoever it was had approached the cabin. I didn't want to panic, so I convinced myself it was probably some hunter or hiker messing around. Maybe they were lost or drunk. It was weird, yeah, but not dangerous. I didn't see any more prints that day. The next night, I locked the door and shut all the curtains. I left the small light in the kitchen on, just so I wouldn't be in complete darkness. I read for a bit, then went to bed. I slept better, probably because I was so tired. But around 2 a.m., I woke up again. Not from a noise, just a feeling. I sat up in bed and listened. Everything was quiet except the fridge humming. Then I heard something faint. Not outside, inside. Something brushed against the wall, like fingertips dragging lightly over wood. Then a soft creak near the front of the cabin. I stared at the bedroom door. My body had gone stiff, like I'd been dipped in ice. I told myself it was the wind, maybe the wood settling. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening for another 20 minutes. Eventually, nothing else happened. I laid back down, eyes wide open, and didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I saw it. On the side of the cabin, just below the window near the kitchen, there were fresh marks, scratches, deep ones like someone had run something sharp along the wall. They were too high for an animal like a raccoon, and they weren't made by claws. It looked like a knife. 5 parallel lines, slanted, about a foot long. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal on my phone. There was no landline. The closest gas station was probably 40 minutes back down the dirt road. I considered just leaving right then, but part of me still didn't want to believe something was wrong. I tried to rationalize again. Maybe it was some hunter screwing around. Maybe the cabin had animals that scratched at the wood. But deep down, I didn't buy it. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't go into the woods. I didn't sit by the lake. I just stayed on the porch and tried to keep myself calm. I had a kitchen knife in my pocket all day, and I kept checking over my shoulder. It was exhausting. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the rocking chair with a flashlight and the knife. The wind picked up around midnight, and trees creaked and swayed, casting long moving shadows across the lake. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. I held my breath and didn't move. The wood under the porch groaned. Then the footsteps stopped right in front of the door. I didn't breathe. I stared at the door and waited for it to rattle, to burst open. But it never did. The steps stayed there for a few seconds. then slowly walked back down the porch and into the woods. I stayed up till dawn. When the sun rose, I went outside. More barefoot tracks. This time they were on the porch, leading up to the door and back down again. Whoever or whatever it was had stood there for a long time. That was enough. I decided I was leaving. I packed up everything, tossed it in the car, and didn't even bother cleaning. I started driving down the dirt road, my hands shaking. I made it maybe 5 miles before I noticed something in the road ahead. First, I thought it was a fallen tree, but as I got closer, I saw it was deliberate. Logs, branches, and brush had been dragged into the road and stacked like a blockade. Someone had built it. I stopped the car and got out. The blockade was thick and wide, too much to move alone. I looked around the woods, but there was no one. I thought about turning around and driving the other direction, but then I remembered the road looped deep into the forest for another 20 miles before hitting another road. I hadn't even seen a map of that way. I wasn't sure I'd make it on gas alone. I stood there thinking for a long time. Then I made a decision I wish I never made. I went back. I didn't want to, but I figured if someone had made that blockade, they might still be out there. And if I got stuck deep in the woods, I'd be completely helpless. At least in the cabin, I could lock the door and wait for daylight. Maybe try the road again tomorrow. Maybe whatever was going on would stop. When I got back to the cabin, something was different. The door was open. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure I locked it. My stomach dropped. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, watching the door swing slowly in the wind. I considered driving away again, but the road was blocked, and I didn't know the other way. So I grabbed the knife and slowly stepped inside. Nothing looked touched. My bags were still near the couch. The kitchen was clean. The bedroom door was open, but it felt wrong. The air inside felt colder. I shut the door, locked it, and pushed the dresser in front of it. I pulled the curtains shut, sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and waited. I didn't move for hours. When night came, I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark. My knife was still in my hand, and every time the wind blew, I jumped. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps, breathing, not mine. Heavy, slow breathing coming from the other side of the wall. It was right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. It stayed there for minutes. I could hear it shift, step, then breathe again, then silence. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I waited until the sun was fully up. Then I took a hatchet from the cabin's woodpile and went back to the blockade. I started breaking it down piece by piece, throwing logs off the road, cutting branches. Took hours. I was never the kind of person who went looking for trouble, and I didn't grow up around danger. I lived in the suburbs all my life, quiet neighborhoods with trimmed lawns and the sound of kids riding their bikes in the evening. That's where I was comfortable. But around late fall last year, I reached a point in my life where I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. I had been working long hours, skipping meals, not sleeping properly, and spending more time behind a desk than with people. I was burned out completely, and I knew I needed a break. A friend of mine, well, not really a close friend, more of an old college acquaintance, had once mentioned that he had a cabin up in the northern woods, somewhere deep in the wilderness near a small town called Crofton. We hadn't talked in years, but I still had his number. On a whim, I texted him asking if he still had it. A day later, he replied that it was still there, still empty, and if I wanted to use it, I could. He just gave me the directions and the lock code, said the place hadn't been touched in almost a year, and told me to enjoy the peace and quiet. The idea of being completely alone in a cabin sounded perfect at the time. I could sleep in, hike a bit, read the books I never had time for, maybe even try to cook real food again. So I packed up my car with essentials: canned food, water, warm clothes, a sleeping bag even though there was a bed there, some flashlights, a small toolbox, and a few other basics. I brought my phone but expected to be off-grid for most of the time since the area was known to have poor reception. It was a long drive. Crofton was already far from any major city, and then the cabin was another hour from there, into the woods. The roads got narrower, bumpier, and eventually turned into a rough dirt track. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid damaging my car. The trees thickened on both sides, and soon I felt like I was driving into a tunnel made out of branches. By the time I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon. The cabin was small but looked solid. One story, wood panels, stone chimney, and a front porch that creaked slightly when I stepped on it. The windows were dusty, but not broken. There was a small tool shed off to the left, half covered in ivy. The forest stretched out in every direction. No other cabins, no roads, just trees. Inside, it smelled old but not rotten, more like wood that had been sitting still for too long. There was a wood stove in the corner, a simple couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a small kitchen area with a sink that didn't work without pumping water first. There was one bedroom with a double bed and another smaller room with shelves that had a few canned goods, some old tools, and a folded-up sleeping cot. I opened the windows to let the stale air out and started settling in. That first night was exactly what I needed. I made a simple meal, read a few chapters from a novel I brought, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through the trees. No cars, no horns, no emails. But by the second night, something started to feel off. It was around 11 p.m., and I had just climbed into bed when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, but it stood out because of how quiet everything else was. I figured it was probably a raccoon or a deer moving through the trees. But then it happened again, maybe 10 minutes later, closer to the cabin. This time, the noise wasn't from dry leaves or snapping twigs. It sounded like something brushing against the side of the cabin wall. I got up and walked over to the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the shape of trees and the faint outline of the tool shed. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. Nothing. I went back to bed. The next morning, I stepped outside with a mug of instant coffee. I looked around the cabin walls and saw what I thought were smudges on the back window, the one behind the kitchen. They weren't there the day before. It looked like dirt, maybe from an animal brushing against it. I shrugged it off, but the pattern kept repeating. Every night around the same time, I'd hear noises, rustling, footsteps, soft thumps. Not loud enough to seem aggressive, just enough to make you feel watched. By the 4th night, I was sitting in the dark with the lights off, just listening. I didn't want to scare away whatever it was. I wanted to know. I sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around me, flashlight in one hand, and waited. At around 11:30, I heard the sound again. A slow crunch of leaves. Then it stopped. Then another. It was walking. That's what it sounded like. Not scurrying, not hopping, walking, human steps. I leaned slowly toward the window and looked out through the corner. I didn't see anything at first, but then I saw it. Someone, a figure. He was standing just past the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, not doing anything, just standing there, not moving. I froze. My stomach turned cold. My fingers tightened on the flashlight. I don't know how long I stood there watching. Felt like forever, but eventually, the man turned and walked slowly back into the trees, disappearing into the dark. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I went out to where I saw him standing. I found faint footprints in the dirt. I followed them a little way into the forest, but they stopped quickly. No sign of anyone, no tent, no gear, just trees. I didn't leave. I should have left, but I told myself maybe it was a hunter. Maybe a local who got lost. Maybe he didn't even see me. Maybe he was just passing through. I convinced myself it was nothing, but I started locking the door at night. I kept the axe from the shed beside my bed. 2 days later, things got worse. I had gone for a short hike around noon, following a small path behind the cabin that led downhill to a dried-up creek bed. I wasn't gone more than an hour, but when I came back, something was different. The front door was open. I had locked it. I always locked it. I stood there staring at it from the tree line for a long time. I couldn't see inside from that angle. I slowly made my way up, listening for any sound. When I finally stepped inside, everything looked normal. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. But on the kitchen counter, someone had placed a small stone, perfectly round. I hadn't seen it before. I checked the back door. Still locked. All the windows were shut. Whoever it was had gotten in and left without disturbing anything. Just the stone. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake with the axe in my hands. Every light on. I thought about driving back, but it was already pitch dark and the road out was rough even in daylight. So I waited. Sometime around 3 a.m., the porch creaked. I knew that sound. I heard it when I arrived. I held my breath and moved slowly to the front window. I saw the figure again, closer this time, right on the porch. He was crouching down like he was trying to peer through the cracks in the wood. His head turned toward the window. I ducked. I stayed crouched behind the couch for what felt like hours. No sounds. No more creaking. When I finally got the nerve to peek out again, he was gone. I waited until dawn before going outside. There were footprints on the porch. Dirty ones. He had been barefoot. I packed everything that morning. I didn't care how early it was. I loaded my gear into the car and got ready to leave. But when I got in, I saw something taped to the inside of the windshield. Piece of paper. It just had one sentence written in thick black marker. "You shouldn't stay here." No name, no signature, just that. I drove out fast, bumping over the rough road, scraping the sides of the car on branches. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and had reception again. I didn't know who to call, so I just kept driving. I ended up back in my apartment 8 hours later, completely drained. I told the guy who owned the cabin everything. He didn't seem surprised. He said a long time ago, a hermit used to live out in those woods. Not in a house, just in the trees. People used to see him sometimes. Sometimes he left strange things behind. Rocks, strings, bones. Nobody ever caught him, and eventually people stopped talking about him. Maybe it was just some guy who didn't want others near his land. Maybe he thought the cabin was an invasion. Whatever it was, I didn't care. I wasn't going back. I still think about that week. Not often, but sometimes. When I hear a sound outside my window, when I see a shape in the trees that doesn't move like a tree should, I wonder what would have happened if I stayed another night. But I didn't. I left, and that's the only reason I'm still here to tell the story. It started with a decision I made late one night in October. I had been working long hours in the city, and the noise, traffic, and constant stress had been grinding me down. I needed a break. I didn't want to go somewhere fancy or crowded. I wanted to go somewhere isolated, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would bother me. That's when I found the listing for the cabin. It was an old wooden cabin located deep in the woods of northern Montana. No neighbors, no town for miles, no cell reception. It was advertised as a place to disconnect completely. The photos showed a small, weathered building surrounded by pine trees, with a wooden porch, a tin roof, and a stone chimney. It looked like the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years, and that was exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 10 days. I packed only what I needed: clothes, food, a few books, my hunting knife, and some tools. I wanted to experience the quiet. I wanted to wake up to the sound of the wind in the trees instead of car horns. The drive was long. I left at sunrise and didn't arrive until the sun was already low behind the hills. I drove down a narrow dirt road that twisted through the woods until I saw it. The cabin. Just like the photos. It looked old, but not abandoned. The wooden boards were gray from age and weather, but solid. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the air was cool and musty. The floor was uneven, and the furniture was basic. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small wood stove, a narrow cot with an old mattress, a counter with a water pump. There was no electricity. The only light would come from the oil lamps and the fireplace. I didn't mind. That first night, I started a fire in the small hearth using some old chopped wood stacked neatly beside it. I heated a can of soup, read a few pages from one of my books by lamplight, and then went to sleep. It was cold, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones. But I was tired enough that I didn't care. The first few days passed without much trouble. I spent my time walking in the woods, cutting firewood, cooking simple meals, and sitting on the porch. The silence out there was heavy, but peaceful. I kept a small journal and noted the wildlife I saw: a fox, a couple of deer, some hawks. Once I spotted what I thought was a black bear in the distance, but it didn't come close. The days were short, and by late afternoon, I was already inside, warming myself near the stove. But on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound. I had just fallen asleep when I heard a sharp knock, not on the front door, but on the side of the cabin. It was quick, 3 short knocks. I sat up. I figured it could have been a branch falling or maybe some animal. I got out of bed, put on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was freezing. I walked around the cabin, shining the light along the walls and the trees. I didn't see anything. No tracks in the dirt. No branches on the ground. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just the old wood settling. I went back inside, locked the door, and climbed back under the heavy blankets. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin. I didn't find anything strange, but I felt off, like someone had been watching me. I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone behind them, but the forest was still. Too still. Even the birds were quiet. That night, I heard the knocking again. This time, it was on the back of the cabin. 3 knocks, then silence. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. I didn't go outside. I sat by the stove, holding my knife, straining my ears. After a while, I went to the window and looked out. The moon was out, and I could see the clearing. Still nothing. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. On the 6th day, I decided to hike further out to see if there were any other cabins or signs of people. I walked for hours. The forest was endless. No trails, no signs, just trees. I climbed a ridge and looked out. Nothing but hills and woods in every direction. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like the forest was swallowing me. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found something that made my stomach turn. There were footprints near the porch. Human footprints. They came from the woods and circled around the cabin. I crouched down and studied them. They were barefoot. No shoes, no socks, just bare human feet in the cold dirt. I stood up, heart racing. I scanned the woods. I didn't see anyone. I checked the door, it was still locked. Nothing inside looked touched. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself maybe it was just some weirdo passing through. But I couldn't stop thinking about how remote the place was. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, my knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The knocking came again, this time on the front door. But it was different. It was slower. 1 knock, then a pause, then another. I held my breath. The knocking continued, steady, spaced out. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then it stopped. After a long silence, I heard footsteps. Slow, soft footsteps walking around the cabin. I sat there all night. The next morning, I saw more footprints. This time, there were more than 1 set. 2, maybe 3 people, all barefoot. I knew then that I wasn't alone, and I wasn't just being messed with. Someone or several people were out there, and they knew I was here. I packed my bag. I had enough food and water to hike out, but the dirt road I drove in on was too long to walk in one day. I decided to hike west toward a ranger station that I had seen on the map. I left a note in the cabin with the date and time, just in case. I made sure the fire was out, locked the door, and headed out. But I didn't make it far. About an hour into the hike, I heard movement behind me. I stopped and turned. Nothing. I kept walking. The sound came again. Footsteps. I sped up. So did the steps. I turned around again, and this time I saw them. 3 figures, maybe 20 yards behind me, all barefoot, all wearing dirty, torn clothes. Their hair was matted, and their skin was pale and filthy. They didn't speak. They just watched me. I ran. I don't know how long or how far I ran. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were going to collapse. I didn't look back. I just ran. Eventually, I found a shallow ravine and crawled into it, hiding beneath some fallen branches. I stayed there for hours, heart pounding in my chest, listening. I heard footsteps several times, sometimes close, sometimes far. Once I heard one of them breathing. It was getting dark when I finally crawled out and started moving again. I didn't know where I was. I had lost the trail. I had no signal. I had no idea if they were still following me. I kept moving. I didn't stop. Not until I saw lights in the distance. It was a fire. I crept closer, hoping it was someone who could help. But as I got closer, I saw them. The same people. They were sitting around a fire in a clearing, eating something. I stayed low and watched. I couldn't see clearly, but the way they moved, the way they chewed, it wasn't normal. I saw something on the ground near the fire. It looked like a piece of clothing, a jacket, one I had seen before. My jacket, the one I left in the cabin. They had been inside. I backed away slowly and then turned and ran. I didn't stop. I moved through the night, not caring where I was going, just getting away. I stumbled, fell, scraped my hands, tore my clothes. My flashlight died. I kept going. When morning came, I found an old logging road. I followed it for hours until I saw a truck. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The driver stopped. He was a local hauling supplies. He looked at me like I was a ghost. He drove me to the nearest town and I called the police. They searched the area. They found the cabin. They found the footprints. But they didn't find the people. They told me it was probably squatters or a drug camp. But I knew it was more than that. These weren't just people hiding out. They were hunting, watching, waiting. I never went back. I sold everything, moved to the city. I still can't sleep well. Every creak in the house, every tap on the window makes my heart race. I lock all my doors. I check my windows twice. That cabin was supposed to be a peaceful escape. But I learned something out there. There are people in this world who live far outside of it. People who don't follow rules or laws. People who see someone alone in the woods and decide that they're fair game. And if I hadn't run when I did, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I rented a small cabin deep in the Idaho woods because I needed to get away. Life in the city had worn me down. Work stress, traffic, noise. Every single day felt like a copy of the last. I needed silence. I needed to be alone, somewhere I couldn't hear horns or alarms or yelling neighbors. That's why I booked the place. A single-room wooden cabin near a frozen lake, far from any town or road. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no cell signal. Just 4 wooden walls, a bed, a fireplace, and a forest full of trees thick as towers. The listing described it as off-grid peace for the soul. At the time, it sounded perfect. I arrived around noon on a Tuesday in late February. The air was sharp and dry, the sky pale gray, and snow lined the dirt road leading up to the property. My rented 4x4 just barely made it through the last half mile. I remember stepping out and hearing nothing. No wind, no birds, not even my own breath at first. Just a dead stillness. The kind that made you realize how much noise you're used to without even knowing it. I liked it. At least I thought I did. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Rustic, tight, made of pine boards, with a rusty tin roof and a narrow front porch that creaked when I stepped on it. A stack of chopped wood sat in a bin by the door. The door was stiff, but it opened fine after I leaned into it. Inside was cold, dark, and smelled faintly like burnt firewood and mold. I turned on the solar-powered lantern near the window, unpacked a few things, and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. Crackled for a while before catching. Once the flames settled in, the whole room began to feel warmer, softer. I sat on the wooden bed frame and felt like I could finally exhale. I stayed inside most of the first day, just resting, reading, listening to the fire. I wasn't used to quiet like that. It was so thick it felt alive. Every creak in the wood, every groan of the structure settling, stood out. But I told myself it was normal. Cabins make noise. They shift. They pop. Especially in cold weather. I didn't let it bother me. That night, I cooked some canned chili on the propane stove and ate by the fire. I watched the flames until my eyes got heavy. Around 10, I shut off the lantern and crawled under the heavy blanket on the bed. The quiet wrapped around me like the dark. For a long time, I just lay there, eyes open, staring at the wooden ceiling. No sounds outside, no wind through the trees, just the slow crack of burning logs. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. to a different sound, something sharp. Not the fire, it was outside, a distinct, hard crunch, like a foot pressing down into packed snow. Then another. I froze. My heartbeat jumped up into my throat. It was definitely footsteps, slow ones, approaching from the side of the cabin. Then they stopped. I stayed as still as I could, listening. My brain was already running through explanations. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer, coyote, something that wandered close. I didn't want to move or make noise. After a few minutes, I heard nothing else. I lay awake for at least an hour, staring at the dark, barely breathing. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't sleep, it was exhaustion. The next morning, I checked outside. No footprints, but there hadn't been fresh snow that night, so I figured any tracks would have blended in with the rest of the frozen surface. I told myself it was nothing. Still, the sound was so clear in my head, like someone walking slowly, one step at a time, right up to the side wall, maybe even stopping to listen. I shook it off and went about my day. I took a walk out past the edge of the property, through some thick pine trees. The woods were beautiful but heavy, tall trunks all around me, stretching up into a gray sky. Snow clung to the lower branches, and my boots made deep crunches as I walked. But the forest was silent. Not quiet, silent. No birdsong, no distant cracking trees. It made me nervous, even though I didn't understand why. I didn't stay out long. On my way back, I saw something odd. A single boot print near the side of the cabin. Just one. Clear as day in the packed snow. It wasn't mine, I checked. Mine had a distinct tread pattern from the rental store. This one was smooth on the edges, older, deeper, like it had pressed into softer snow that had frozen since. Just the one. Not a path. Just one step by the corner of the cabin, facing the wall. That night, I didn't sleep much. I left the fire going low, sat by the window with a flashlight, and watched the woods. At some point near midnight, I thought I saw something move out by the tree line. Just a flicker. Could have been a branch. Could have been my eyes playing tricks on me. But it felt too steady, too slow, like someone moving sideways, from one tree to another. I kept watching. Nothing else moved. The next day, I debated leaving, packing up and just driving back early. But I didn't want to feel like I'd let my nerves ruin the trip. I kept telling myself I was just spooking myself. Cabin fever, maybe. I made myself walk down to the frozen lake a mile away. It helped a bit. Being in the open, seeing the white frozen surface stretch out across the valley. But even there, I had the feeling that someone was watching me, that I wasn't alone. I kept looking back at the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing. When I returned to the cabin, the door was open, just a few inches, enough that it swung a bit in the wind. I stood there, completely still. My chest went tight. I hadn't left it open, I was sure of that. I had a habit of checking the latch twice, every time I stepped out. I'd even paused on the porch before walking away to make sure. I stared at it for a while before walking up. When I got closer, I could see faint marks in the snow, like someone had been standing near the door. The snow there was a bit more packed down, almost scuffed. I went inside slowly, holding a hatchet I'd brought in one hand. The room was quiet, looked the same. The fire was out. The bed was untouched. Nothing missing. Nothing moved, at least not that I could tell right away. But then I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. A spoon on the counter that I hadn't used. It wasn't from the drawer. It was old, tarnished, looked like something from a different set, slightly bent at the neck, just sitting there like it belonged. I checked the windows, still latched. I tried to stay calm. I sat in the far corner of the room with my back against the wall, hatchet in my lap, flashlight in my hand. I stayed like that until the sun started going down. Then I built the fire again, even though I wasn't sure I wanted the light. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me flinch. I kept my boots on just in case. The next morning, I decided it was over. I was leaving. I packed my gear, loaded everything into the 4x4, and went back inside for one last look. I didn't want to, but I had to make sure I hadn't left anything. That's when I noticed it. On the back of the bedroom door, carved faintly into the wood, was a line of text I hadn't seen before. Just a few words, scratched in with something sharp. Still watching. My stomach dropped. I hadn't written that. No one should have been inside. No one should have even known I was here. I turned and left without a second thought. Drove down the rough road as fast as I could without sliding. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see someone step out of the trees. I didn't stop until I hit a main road with traffic. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for 20 minutes just breathing. My hands were shaking. I looked through all my stuff. Everything seemed there, nothing missing. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had gotten inside. Not just into the cabin, but into my life in a way I couldn't understand. Whoever it was, they didn't want anything. They just wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Back in the city, I tried to forget about it. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? I didn't even have proof. Just some markings in the snow, a strange spoon, and a message on the back of a door. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't leave a review. Weeks later, I was walking home from work when I passed a parked van on the side of the road. I didn't think much of it until I glanced at the front seat. On the dashboard, sitting dead center, was a spoon, tarnished, bent at the neck. I stopped. My throat went dry. My heart thudded like a drum in my chest. I couldn't move. It was the exact same shape, same bend, same dull color. The van was empty. No one inside. No one nearby. I turned and walked away quickly, looking over my shoulder the whole time. I never saw who owned it. Since then, things have been quiet, but I still check the locks twice. I still avoid cabins. And every now and then, when I walk alone down a quiet street, I get the sense that someone is just out of sight, standing still, watching. Not because they want to hurt me, just because. It all started when I needed a break from the city. Work had been stressing me out. Loud horns, people pushing through subway doors, blinking computer screens, coffee that tasted like burnt water. It all piled up. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't eating right. I was always tired. So I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana for a full week. It was one of those basic listings on a rental website. Just a photo of a red wooden cabin in front of a tree line, one tiny kitchen inside, a bathroom that used a well for water, no Wi-Fi, and no neighbors for miles. That's what drew me to it. No noise, no people, no cell signal. I thought that would be a good thing. I arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon in early October. The trees were already bare. Leaves covered the road like thick brown carpet. I had to drive through 10 miles of a narrow dirt path once I left the main highway. The drive felt longer than expected. Trees crowded both sides of the road. They stood tall and dry, unmoving like frozen statues. No wind, no animals, no birds. Just a long road and the hum of my car engine. The cabin looked older than in the pictures. The red paint was peeling. The steps leading to the door creaked under my weight. But it was clean inside. The furniture was basic: a twin-sized bed, a wooden chair, a small table, and a shelf filled with old paperback books and maps of the area. The kitchen had a small stove, some pots and pans, and a faucet that made a loud clunk whenever I turned it. I unpacked, made some tea, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. It got dark very quickly. With no city lights, the sky turned black within minutes, and the silence outside was almost too quiet. I turned on the small lamp near the bed and opened a book. For the first few hours, I finally felt like I could breathe. That night, I heard something walking outside, just soft crunching on the leaves. I figured it was a deer or some raccoon. I ignored it. Animals are common out here. But the sound stopped right behind the cabin, where the bedroom window faced the tree line. I turned the lamp off and stood still in the dark. The sound didn't come back. so I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. The next day was uneventful. I made some breakfast, read more from the old books, and sat outside for a while. It was cold but peaceful. I hiked for a bit, maybe a mile around the property, following a shallow trail into the woods. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet the forest was. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional creak of tree branches shifting slowly overhead. At some point during the walk, I felt like something was behind me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a feeling. I turned around and stared into the trees. Everything was still. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. I didn't want to scare myself, so I headed back to the cabin. I made soup, warmed my hands near the stove, and tried not to let my imagination ruin the peace. That night, I locked the door and checked all the windows before bed. The sound came back, footsteps in the leaves. This time slower, closer. I didn't get up. I lay still in bed, trying to match the rhythm with something natural. Deer, foxes, anything. But then I heard a sharp knock. Not on the door, on the side of the cabin. Just once. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. By the third day, I was tired. I looked for footprints outside in the morning, but the leaves made it hard to see anything clear. I walked around the cabin, looked near the woods, but saw nothing unusual. I started to think maybe a branch fell or an animal had bumped into the wall. I didn't want to leave early. I had paid for the full week, and I didn't want to seem like some city idiot who got scared of the woods. That afternoon, I sat near the fire pit outside. I didn't light it. I just sat on a log watching the trees. There was something off about the tree line, like the same trees kept repeating, the same tall shape, same spacing. I stared at it for what felt like an hour. That feeling came back, like something was watching me from within. I stood up and walked back into the cabin. I didn't look back. That night was colder. I wore 2 layers and kept the small stove on for extra heat. I shut the bedroom window tight and drew the curtains. I lay in bed, tired but alert. At one point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to the sound of metal. Not footsteps, metal. It was the sound of the doorknob turning. The sound stopped as soon as I sat up. I stared at the bedroom door, heart beating so fast I felt it in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the main room. The door was still locked. I checked it twice, but then I noticed the floor mat was slightly moved. I hadn't touched it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the lights on and sat in the wooden chair, staring at the door until morning. By the 4th day, I was done pretending everything was fine. I wanted to leave. I packed everything, loaded my bags into the car, and tried to start it. Nothing. The engine clicked, but it wouldn't turn over. I tried again, and again. Still nothing. The battery wasn't dead, it made noise, but the engine wouldn't start. I opened the hood. I know next to nothing about cars, but even I could see something was wrong. A thick rubber tube was missing, cut clean. Someone had tampered with it. My phone still had no signal, no internet, nothing. I was stuck. I stayed outside in daylight. I didn't want to be inside that cabin anymore. I ate whatever I could, crackers, dry food, whatever was left. I didn't want to use the stove. I didn't want to hear anything inside. I thought maybe I could walk to the highway. It was 10 miles away, but I had boots and a backpack. I figured I'd leave in the morning and take only what I needed. That night, I stayed dressed and kept a small knife from the kitchen under the pillow. I didn't even try to sleep. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps again. Slow, steady. Then a shadow passed in front of the curtains. Not an animal. Person. I didn't move. I held my breath for what felt like an hour. No knock, no noise, just silence. After daylight, I got up, grabbed my bag, and started walking. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I kept moving, eyes scanning every tree, every movement. A few times I thought I saw something between the trees, movement, a flash of dark clothing. But when I turned to look, it was gone. Around the 6th mile, I noticed a small campfire circle, long abandoned. Blackened stones, broken branches around it, and something else, piece of clothing, torn jacket. I picked it up, Inside the pocket was a set of keys, a car key and a small key I didn't recognize. No ID, no wallet. I left the jacket there and kept walking. I reached the highway by sunset. My legs were shaking, my throat dry, my feet numb. I stuck my thumb out every time a car passed. Finally, a truck stopped. The driver gave me a look, half curious, half worried, but he didn't ask questions. I got to the nearest town and called the sheriff. When they checked the cabin, they found the car had been tampered with. No fingerprints. The dirt path had signs of another vehicle parked off to the side, hidden between trees. They found old footprints circling the cabin, multiple sizes, not one person. They searched the woods for days. They never found anyone. No sign of whoever had been watching me. No trace of who knocked on the wall. No explanation for the cut engine tube. No answer for how long they had been watching me. Just silence. I don't go to cabins anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. Even in the city, I check all the locks twice before bed. Because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the trees. And I still feel someone standing just behind them, waiting for me to come back. It started with a simple plan. I needed to get away from everything for a few days. Work was draining me. City noise kept me up at night, and I felt like I hadn't taken a proper breath in months. I found a listing online for a small, remote cabin up north, somewhere in the mountains, near a lake, miles from the closest town. The photos showed an old wooden cabin with a green tin roof, a front porch that sagged a little, and tall trees all around it. It looked like the kind of place where no one would bother you. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive there took almost 7 hours. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest. My tires kicked up clouds of dust, and I had to keep slowing down to avoid potholes and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was stepping out of the world I knew. No cell service, no other cars, no people. Just trees and silence. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already low behind the hills. The place looked smaller in real life, but that didn't bother me. I unloaded my gear, mostly food, clothes, some tools, and a cooler with ice. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under the flower pot on the porch. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust. The air was still and everything was quiet. There was one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A single hallway led to a tiny bathroom and a second, and used bedroom. I opened every window to let in some air. There was no TV, no internet, and the power was from a generator out back, but I didn't plan to use it much. I had a flashlight, a lantern, and a pile of books. I was looking forward to the silence. The first night went by without much to say. I sat on the porch, listened to the wind, watched the stars come out. It got cold quickly after dark, so I started a fire in the stove and fell asleep early. The next morning, I went for a walk around the property. The trees were thick, the lake was just a short hike downhill, and everything felt untouched. There were no signs of people, no litter, no trails, not even old footprints. I liked that. I spent most of that day reading and chopping some firewood just to stay busy. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel a little off. I had just gone to bed, and the wind had picked up a little outside. I kept hearing a soft thump on the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it was branches moving in the wind, but it wasn't random. Came every few seconds, steady like footsteps. I sat up and held my breath. The sound stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the window. Nothing, just trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I waited a while, then went back to bed. The noise didn't come again. The next day, I noticed something strange in the dirt by the side of the house. A line of small prints, too big for a squirrel, too small for a bear, just leading up to the wall and stopping there. No prints leading away. The ground was dry and hard, so I figured I was just seeing things. Maybe raccoons. That night, I locked the doors and set the flashlight by my bed. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I walked into the bathroom, did my thing, and as I was washing my hands, I looked up at the small window above the sink. There was a smudge on the glass. It looked like a fingerprint, but it was on the outside. I stood there for a long time just staring. The cabin was 5 feet off the ground. That window was higher than my head. I opened the back door slowly and stepped out. It was freezing. I pointed my flashlight at the window. Nothing. I checked the bushes nearby. Nothing. No tracks. No movement. I stayed out there for almost an hour just listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the tight feeling in my chest. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked a few miles along the dirt road, thinking maybe I could get a signal on my phone and check in with someone, or just hear a voice. Nothing. No signal. I felt more alone than ever. When I got back, I noticed something small but unsettling. The firewood pile I had stacked neatly 2 days before was a mess. Pieces were scattered across the yard like someone had kicked through it. I hadn't done that. I didn't see any animal prints, and nothing else had been touched. Just the wood pile. That evening, I set up a chair on the porch with a thermos of coffee and waited. I sat there until midnight. I didn't hear anything. No sounds. No movement. Just darkness pressing in on all sides. I went inside, locked up, and turned in. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. This time it was from a sound inside the cabin. A soft creaking, like a footstep on the wood floor. I froze. My heart was pounding. I reached for the flashlight and turned it on quickly. The sound stopped. I scanned the room, nothing. I walked slowly around the cabin, light in hand. Nothing moved. Every door and window was still locked. But I knew what I heard. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I had planned to stay 4 more days, but I didn't care anymore. Something wasn't right. I packed my stuff quickly and opened the front door. On the porch, right in the middle, was a small pile of stones. They were stacked neatly like a cairn. 5 stones, perfectly balanced. I hadn't done that. I kicked it over and walked around the cabin in a full circle. Nothing. No prints. No signs of anyone. I loaded up my truck and started driving. But about 10 minutes down the road, my front tire blew out. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to the side. I got out and looked. The tire was shredded like someone had cut into it. I opened the back and pulled out the spare. It took almost an hour to get it changed, and the whole time, I kept glancing at the trees around me, half expecting someone to step out. I finally got moving again. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. As soon as I had signal, I called the cabin owner and told him what happened. He just said he hadn't been up there in months. I didn't bother arguing. I just wanted to get home. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about it. The noises, the fingerprints, the stones. It didn't make sense. I looked up the area online. No recent crimes, no missing people, no strange news. But I did find a blog from someone who had stayed at a nearby cabin years ago. They didn't go into detail, but they said they'd left early too. Said the silence out there wasn't normal. That's all they said. It's been a few months now. I haven't gone back, and I won't. I still don't know what was out there or who or why. Maybe it was just some drifter messing with me. Maybe someone lives out there in those woods and doesn't want visitors. I'll never know. But that feeling, being watched, being followed, it stayed with me. And even now, sometimes, when I'm home at night, I think I hear that same soft thump outside my window, like footsteps, steady, coming closer. That's how it started. I'd been living in the city for too long, surrounded by car horns, angry people, construction sounds, sirens that never stopped. My apartment was a shoebox stacked on top of other shoeboxes. I had a job that drained every bit of energy out of me. I worked in IT support, sitting in front of a screen for 9 hours a day while trying to sound polite to people who didn't even know how to restart their laptops. When I got off work, I would sit in traffic or squeeze into a crowded train and then get home just to hear my upstairs neighbor stomping around like a giant. I needed quiet. So one Friday in October, I rented a cabin in the woods. I found it online. The ad said it was 2 hours outside the city, near a small town I'd never heard of. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine trees. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, and a wood-burning stove. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Sounded perfect. I packed light, just clothes, food, a few books, and some firewood in case it got cold at night. I brought my folding knife too, not because I expected trouble, just habit. I had it ever since college. The drive up was peaceful. After I left the highway, the road turned narrow and winding, climbing through hills and trees that burned with autumn colors. Red, orange, gold, it looked like something from a postcard. I passed a few farms and saw maybe 2 other cars the whole way. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, it was late afternoon and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but I didn't mind. It had a steep metal roof, 1 front-facing window, and a porch with 2 wooden chairs. I parked beside it, got out, and just stood there for a minute. The only sound I could hear was the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. It was quiet. Finally, inside, the cabin was clean and simple. 1 open room with a bed against the back wall, a small table and 2 chairs, a stove in the corner, and a bathroom behind a wooden door. Everything smelled like pine wood and a little bit of old smoke. There was a stack of chopped firewood next to the stove and a lantern on the table. The power worked, and the water ran cold but clean. I made a quick dinner, unpacked my things, and stepped outside with a beer. The forest around the cabin was thick and darkening. I stood on the porch and just listened. No cars, no yelling, no hum of electronics, just silence. Felt like I could finally breathe again. I slept better that first night than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up around 7. It was cold inside, so I made coffee and started a fire in the stove. I spent the day walking around the woods, staying within a mile or so of the cabin. The air smelled sharp and fresh. Every now and then, I saw a rabbit or heard something moving through the underbrush. I found a little stream running not far downhill. I sat there for a while, just listening to the water. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was going down. I made dinner and read a book until my eyes started to close. Before going to bed, I stepped out to the porch. The moon was bright, and the trees looked black and silver. I thought I heard something snap in the woods, a branch maybe, but figured it was just a deer or raccoon. Animals lived out here. I wasn't worried. That changed the next night. The third day started the same. I walked deeper into the woods that morning, maybe a little farther than I should have. I didn't bring a compass or map because I figured I'd stay close. But when I stopped and looked around, the trees looked the same in every direction. I kept walking in what I thought was the right way, and after 20 minutes, I found the stream again. I followed it until I found the trail back. Shook me a little, just enough to remind me I was alone out here. That evening, I lit a fire early because the air was colder. I sat on the porch again with a blanket wrapped around my legs, watching the light fade. I thought I heard the same kind of snap in the woods, like a branch breaking, but sharper this time. Then I heard another, a little closer. I leaned forward in the chair, trying to hear better. Then it stopped. I waited for 5 or 6 minutes, but nothing else happened. I figured it was just an animal again. Maybe something bigger, like a deer stepping wrong. I went inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Something woke me up. It was the middle of the night. I didn't have a clock, but the fire in the stove had burned down low, and the room was dim. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I did. Footsteps, outside the cabin. I sat up in bed and held my breath. They were slow and careful, crunching softly through the leaves and twigs outside. I couldn't tell which direction they came from. I got out of bed and went to the window beside the front door, standing to the side so I wouldn't be seen if someone was looking in. I didn't see anything at first. The moon was out again, and the yard in front of the cabin was faintly lit. The trees looked like tall shadows. I stayed there for a few minutes, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. Nothing. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there longer than I meant to, 10 minutes, maybe more. When I didn't hear or see anything else, I went back to bed but didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for prints. The ground was dry and the fallen leaves were thick, but near the back corner of the cabin, I saw a patch of crushed leaves. It was wide and flat like a boot print. Could have been mine, I thought, but it didn't match the path I used earlier. I told myself it didn't mean anything, just nerves. That night, it happened again. I woke up around 3 a.m. The fire had burned out. The cabin was dark. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I heard it. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a soft tapping sound on the back wall. Tap, 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 like someone using a stick to poke the wood. It moved slowly, like it was circling. First the back wall, then the side near the bathroom. Then it stopped. Silence. Then footsteps again. Crunch, crunch. Then the porch creaked. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my ears. I grabbed the folding knife from the nightstand and crept toward the front window. I stayed low and moved slowly, afraid that whatever was outside could see through the glass. I peeked out the window. First, I saw nothing. Then, right near the edge of the porch steps, I saw it. A man. He was standing completely still, facing the cabin. I couldn't see his face. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and something about his shape told me he wasn't holding a flashlight or phone. He just stood there, staring. I dropped to the floor and crawled back toward the bed. My breathing was shallow, chest tight. I waited. I thought maybe he would knock or try the door. Maybe he'd walk around again. But after a few minutes, I heard footsteps backing away, slow and steady. Then nothing. I stayed on the floor until the sun came up. That morning, I saw clear boot prints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't mine. Too large. The steps led out toward the woods, then vanished into the leaves. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal, and the nearest town was over an hour away. I thought about driving back, but something in me didn't want to run. I wanted to believe maybe it was a hiker, a lost hunter, something explainable. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I didn't go to bed. I kept the fire going low, sat in the chair with my knife and waited. Around 2 a.m., I heard the tapping again. This time, it was on the sidewall right next to the window. Then footsteps, then silence. I stayed up until dawn, staring at the door. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care if I had more nights booked. I was done. As I put my bag in the car, I saw something carved into the tree near the porch. 3 deep cuts, vertical, like claw marks but wider, like someone had taken a knife and dragged it hard down the bark. I drove fast, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway. When I got home, I looked up the area. I found a few old reports missing hikers from the same region. A couple of articles mentioned a man seen walking through private land at night, watching cabins. He was never caught. I never went back to that part of the country. Now, every once in a while, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think about that man, standing on the porch, staring, waiting. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything. Work was draining me. I felt like I was just going through the motions every day, like I was trapped inside a loop. Same alarm clock, same crowded train, same endless emails, same cheap takeout dinner. I needed something else for a while, a break, something away from people, noise, traffic, just me and nature. That's when I booked a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I found the place online. It was a simple 1-bedroom cabin. No neighbors for miles. A dirt road led to it from a side highway. The photos showed a small wooden structure with a tin roof, a porch, and a fire pit out front. It looked peaceful, quiet, isolated, just what I wanted. I packed a week's worth of food, clothes, a first aid kit, a big flashlight, and my old hunting knife, even though I didn't plan on hunting. I also brought a couple of books and a notebook to write in. I didn't bring any electronics besides my phone, which barely had signal by the time I got off the highway. I didn't care. I wasn't planning to talk to anyone. The drive took longer than expected. By the time I reached the turnoff to the dirt road, the sky was already turning dark. Trees pressed close to both sides of the road. The tires of my car crunched over the gravel and dirt, the sound echoing louder than I expected. Every now and then I had to slow down for deep potholes or fallen branches. The GPS stopped working about 10 minutes down the road. I kept going, relying on printed directions I had saved. Eventually I saw the cabin. It looked just like the pictures, maybe a little older. The porch sagged slightly, and the wood was weathered gray. There was a chopping block out front with an axe sticking out of it. Behind the cabin, thick forest stretched out in every direction. I turned off the car, and the quiet hit me like a wave. No wind, no birds, just silence. I unloaded my bags and brought them inside. The cabin was small but functional. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table, a wood stove, and a bed in the corner. There was a separate bathroom with a compost toilet and a gravity-fed shower. I lit a few candles, unpacked, and made a quick dinner on the gas stove. Then I sat on the porch in the dark and listened. There was nothing to hear. No crickets, no wind, no rustling branches. Just the soft sound of the forest holding its breath. I sat there for almost an hour watching the stars come out. Then I went inside and locked the door. I wasn't scared, not yet, just a little unnerved. I told myself it was normal, just not used to the silence. The first night was mostly fine. I woke up once in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something outside. A soft thump, then a scraping noise. But when I looked out the window, I didn't see anything. I figured it was an animal. I went back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There were no trails, just thick woods. I wandered for an hour or two, careful to keep track of my path. I didn't want to get lost. The forest felt old. Tall pines and maples, a thick bed of fallen leaves underfoot. Sometimes I thought I heard things behind me. Twigs snapping, something moving through the brush. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. That night, the noises outside got louder. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. I heard footsteps. They weren't fast, just slow, deliberate crunching in the leaves around the cabin. I stayed in bed at first, listening. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window. I couldn't see anyone. I opened the front door slowly and stepped onto the porch. There was nothing out there. I walked around the cabin with the flashlight. Still nothing. No tracks, no movement. Just cold air and silence. I locked the door tighter that night. The third day, I found something strange. I was chopping wood when I noticed footprints behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I had only been walking around the front and sides. These led from the woods to the back wall, then disappeared. They looked like bare feet, not boots, just human-shaped, naked feet. The weirdest part was the toes. They were long, too long, like fingers. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe an animal stepped just right. I tried to believe that, but it didn't feel right. I swept the prints away and went back inside. That night, I didn't sleep well. The steps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Over and over again. Slow, steady, sometimes stopping, then starting again. I stayed in bed, gripping the knife under my pillow. I didn't go outside. When morning came, I checked around the cabin again. No footprints, no signs of anything. It was like the forest erased them overnight. That day, I didn't go far. I sat on the porch with the knife close, eyes scanning the trees. I kept thinking I saw something move. Shadows between trees, a shape ducking behind a trunk. Every time I focused, it was gone. On the fifth night, it got worse. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were heavier, like something dragging its feet. Then I heard breathing, slow, wheezing breathing just outside the window. I didn't move. I just lay there, trying not to make a sound. The breathing lasted for minutes. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard the front doorknob rattle, turned slowly. Then it stopped. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair with the knife in my hand, staring at the door until sunrise. When it was light enough, I packed my things. I didn't care if the trip was supposed to be a week. I was leaving. I stuffed everything in the car and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Just a clicking sound. Battery dead. I checked the hood. Everything looked fine. No wires cut. I tried again. Nothing. The car was dead. I had no cell signal. No way to call anyone. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding. I considered walking to the highway. It was at least 12 miles. through dense woods with no trail. I didn't even know if I could make it, but I didn't want to stay another night. I packed a small bag with water, some food, the flashlight, and the knife. I marked the cabin with an arrow scratched into the wood, pointing toward the road. Then I started walking. The woods were silent. The only sound was my breathing and the crunch of leaves. I walked for hours, checking the compass, staying in a straight line. But the forest started to feel strange. Trees looked the same in every direction. Sometimes I thought I saw my own footprints. Once I saw a broken branch that I swear I already passed. It felt like I was walking in circles. I stopped to rest, sitting on a log. That's when I saw it. A small bundle of cloth tied with twine, sitting at the base of a tree. I didn't put it there. I walked over and untied it. Inside was a dead bird, its neck twisted, feathers plucked, wrapped in old leaves. I dropped it and backed away. My skin felt cold all over. I kept walking. By sunset, I was exhausted. My legs hurt. I hadn't seen the road. I set up a small fire with dry sticks and tried to stay awake. I didn't want to sleep. I kept hearing movement in the trees, cracking branches, soft dragging sounds. Sometime in the night, I must have dozed off. I woke up to find the fire out and the bag gone. My flashlight was gone too. Only the knife remained, lying beside me. I don't know how I didn't hear anything. I started walking again at first light. I was starving. No water left. My throat was dry. I walked until my legs gave out. I lay there thinking this was it. But then I heard something. An engine. I stood up and stumbled toward the sound. I came out onto a road. Not the dirt one. A real paved road. I waved my arms, shouting. Pickup truck slowed and pulled over. A man got out. I couldn't speak. He loaded me into the truck and gave me water. I passed out. When I woke up, I was in a small hospital in a nearby town. I told them I had been lost in the woods. I didn't mention the noises, the breathing, the bundle. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. They said I was lucky to make it out, that people got lost out there all the time. I asked about the cabin. They said it had burned down 5 years ago. A lightning strike. No one rebuilt it. I know what I saw. I know where I stayed. I wasn't imagining it. The cabin was there. I slept in it. I lived in it for days. But when I went back with local authorities, all we found was a charred foundation, overgrown with moss. No axe, no woodpile, nothing. I never found my car. I moved out of the city after that. I needed open space, but I never go near the woods alone now. And sometimes, when I'm up late at night, I still hear that slow, dragging step outside my window. I'd been working as a freelance writer for a little over 5 years by the time I decided to rent a remote cabin in northern Minnesota to focus on finishing a manuscript. I'd been meaning to write a true crime novel based on a cold case that happened in the late 90s, a disappearance that had gone mostly under the radar. City life was making it hard to focus, and I thought if I isolated myself somewhere without internet, phone service, or distractions, I'd finally get it done. That was the whole idea. Just me, a laptop with no Wi-Fi, a couple notebooks, and quiet. I found a cabin listing on a regional forum, one of those old, text-heavy sites people still used in certain communities. The photos looked basic. One-bedroom cabin, small kitchen, a fireplace, a desk. It was about 40 minutes from the nearest town, tucked along a logging road that wasn't plowed in the winter. But this was September, and the listing said the cabin was stocked and fully functional, with a backup generator just in case. The guy renting it out only gave a P.O. box as a return address, and I mailed a money order and got a key back a week later. I probably should have seen that as a red flag, but I just wanted to be alone. I even told my family not to check in, and I posted a note on my socials saying I'd be offline for a couple of weeks. I was looking forward to disappearing into my own thoughts. The drive up from Duluth took about 2.5 hours. The paved highway turned into gravel after the last gas station. Then the gravel road narrowed, and eventually became more like 2 long dirt ruts winding through woods thick with pine, spruce, and birch trees. I only passed 2 houses in that last half hour. The first one had a rotting porch and a deer stand built into a tree right on the edge of their backyard. The second looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Windows boarded, moss on the roof. After that, it was just forest and the occasional sound of tires crunching over loose stone. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, but not run down. It looked like it had been built sometime in the 70s. The wood was weathered gray and green in spots. The steps creaked under my boots as I climbed up onto the porch. I unlocked the door and stepped into stale air and silence. The layout was simple. One room with a small kitchenette to the right, a desk in front of a window facing the trees, a twin bed against the back wall, and a wood stove. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards from the back door, just a narrow path through the trees leading to it. There was a solar battery setup that powered a couple of light bulbs and an old fridge that made a weird humming sound when it kicked on. I unpacked quickly. My laptop, 2 paper notebooks, pens, a few cans of soup, instant coffee, and a stack of manila folders with all the case files I had printed off earlier. There was no cell service, as expected. I didn't bring any books or distractions, just work. That first day was uneventful. I chopped some wood from the pile out back, made some black coffee, and sat at the desk flipping through notes. It was almost too quiet, but I liked it. The only real sounds were wind through the trees and the occasional snap of branches. I barely saw any wildlife, just a few squirrels darting along the forest floor. Night fell fast. There were no curtains, so I taped up some sheets of paper over the windows to keep the darkness out. The kind of darkness you forget exists when you live in a city, so thick it almost has weight. I made a small fire in the stove and sat in silence while I wrote a few thousand words. I was already making good progress. It was only around 10 p.m. when I decided to get some sleep. I wasn't tired yet, but the cabin got cold once the fire died down. The bed was firm and the blanket thin. I lay there for hours, drifting in and out, listening to sounds outside. Not animal sounds exactly, more like wood cracking, soft thuds, or maybe things falling from trees. It was hard to tell. Every sound out there echoes strangely. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard something brushing against the wall outside. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was steady, like a slow drag. Not loud, more like something rubbing the side of the building. Then it stopped. I held my breath for a while and waited, but nothing else happened. I convinced myself it was a branch and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The grass was wet with dew, and I noticed scuff marks along the wood on one side. It looked like something had scraped the bottom of the wall, but it wasn't a claw or anything. It looked almost like fabric, as if someone had brushed up against it while walking by. I stared into the woods for a long time that morning. The trees stood still, leaves barely rustling. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything. Still, I felt watched. That whole day, I had trouble focusing. I'd write a paragraph and then get up to look out the window. Write another and then check the back door was still locked. By nightfall, I was tense. I double-checked the locks, shoved a chair under the doorknob even though it probably wouldn't do much. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small noises, something tapping or clicking, always outside. I told myself it was squirrels. By the third day, I was starting to feel off. Not sick, but anxious. I walked deeper into the woods, following the old trail the cabin owner had mentioned in his note. The trees got tighter the further I went, the canopy letting in less light. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes before I saw the cabin through the trees again from a different angle. I had looped in a wide circle without realizing it. That weirdly unsettled me more than anything. I hadn't turned. I was sure I had gone in a straight line, but somehow I ended up back where I started. I went back inside and didn't go out again that day. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a loud thump. Not outside, inside. My heart started racing immediately, the kind of sound you don't mishear. It was a single heavy noise, like someone dropping a boot on the wood floor. I lay perfectly still. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could barely make out the shapes of my bags near the door. Everything looked normal. Nothing moved. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I heard something else, a very soft creak, from the kitchen area. Just one creak, like pressure on a floorboard. I was too scared to move. I stayed frozen in the bed for at least an hour, gripping a flashlight like a weapon. At some point, I must have drifted off. In the morning, everything looked the same, but I knew something was off. One of the chairs by the table was pushed back at a slight angle, just enough that I noticed it wasn't how I'd left it. I didn't sit in that chair. I hadn't used the table at all. I had only eaten standing by the stove or sitting on the bed. I started locking the door even when I was inside during the day. I stopped writing. I kept a hatchet by the bed. I started walking around outside every hour, checking for prints, listening. I never saw anyone, but I felt it. On the 5th day, I finally found something. Behind the cabin, near the outhouse, there were boot prints. At least 4 of them, spaced in a way that suggested someone had been standing still. The ground was soft there, so the prints were deep. The boots were larger than mine, and had a thick tread like work boots. I hadn't gone out there in 2 days. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the hatchet in my lap, light off, eyes fixed on the treeline. Just before dawn, I saw something move. Not an animal, person. They were standing between 2 trees, maybe 30 feet out. I could only make out their outline, broad shoulders, tall. They didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there for maybe 5 minutes. Then they turned and disappeared into the woods. I packed my bags as soon as the sun was up. I threw everything into the car, turned the key, and nothing happened. The battery was dead. I checked the hood. Cables were fine. Nothing obviously wrong. But someone had left a small pile of twigs on the windshield, stacked like a pyramid. That's not something you just overlook. That was left there, on purpose. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell signal. I could walk to town, but it would take hours and I'd have to leave everything behind. I decided to wait it out and try to flag someone down if a car passed. But no one came. The road was empty. That night, I barricaded the door with furniture and stayed awake with the hatchet in hand. I didn't hear anything. No tapping, no footsteps, just silence. That was worse, somehow. The next morning, I found more prints. This time on the porch. Dirty, wet prints. They had stepped right up to the door and stood there. Just stood. I wanted to throw up. I grabbed my bags again and started walking. I carried the hatchet and left everything else. I walked all the way down the dirt road, past the abandoned house, past the deer stand, until I finally got to a house with a mailbox. A truck was parked in the driveway. I knocked. The man who lived there didn't say much, but he let me use his phone. I called a tow truck and got my car jumped. I never went back to the cabin. I left it just like that, unlocked, laptop still inside. I drove straight home and never wrote another word about that cold case. I didn't want to know who was out there or why they were watching me. All I know is it started with a break I thought I needed. Life in the city had been noisy, fast, and draining. My job was stressing me out more than usual. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with emails and reminders, and the noise of cars outside my apartment never let up. I felt like I was burning out, waking up tired, going to sleep exhausted, and never really feeling like I was actually present. So I booked a week off from work, turned off every notification on my phone, and rented a cabin I found online. The pictures showed a small, old wooden cabin sitting alone near a lake surrounded by pine trees. It looked peaceful and quiet. That was all I wanted. I drove up early on a Monday morning. The roads got narrower and rougher as I got further from town, and by the time I turned off the main road and onto a dirt path, I had no cell service. I didn't care. That was the plan. Total silence, no internet, no screens. I brought some food, water, my old camping stove just in case, and a few books. The cabin was supposed to have a working kitchen and a small generator for electricity. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep the lights on at night. When I arrived, the place looked just like the photos. A weathered wooden cabin with a steep roof, sitting near a still, dark lake. The trees stood tall and thick around it. No other buildings in sight. There wasn't even a dock on the water. Just stillness. I parked my car a few feet from the front porch, got out, and breathed in the fresh, pine-scented air. I felt calm right away. The inside of the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed on one side, a small table and 2 chairs near the window, and a kitchen area with a tiny fridge, a sink, and a stove. There was also a bathroom in the back with a working toilet and a small shower. Everything was old but clean. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just quiet. The first day went by peacefully. I unpacked, took a walk by the lake, read a few chapters of a novel, and cooked a simple dinner. That night, the sky was full of stars. There were no clouds and no light pollution. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me and stared at the stars for hours. I felt like I could finally breathe. The second day, I woke up just as the sun was coming up. The lake looked like glass. I made coffee, ate toast with peanut butter, and walked along the edge of the water. I found some animal tracks in the mud, probably deer, maybe a raccoon. I saw a couple of squirrels climbing the trees and birds calling back and forth. It was quiet, but it didn't feel empty, just peaceful. It was around the third night that things began to feel off. I had been reading inside the cabin, using one of the small lamps plugged into the generator, when I thought I heard something outside. First, it was soft like a branch breaking, then a louder crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze and listened, but I didn't hear it again. I tried to brush it off. Animals move through woods all the time. Could have been a deer or even a bear passing by. I turned off the light, peeked through the window, but didn't see anything. Just darkness. I went to bed, but I kept waking up, half aware of sounds outside. Small taps, scratches, a low rustling near the back wall of the cabin. I stayed still in bed and waited for it to stop. It always did after a while, and I finally fell asleep. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was disturbed near the back, like someone or something had been there. There were marks in the dirt, but I couldn't tell what made them. They weren't clear enough to be footprints. I told myself again that it was probably an animal, maybe raccoons digging around, looking for food. I spent most of that day inside. I didn't feel like going for a walk. I couldn't explain why, but the trees looked darker than they had before, and the quiet felt heavier. I read, cooked lunch, and tried to ignore the unease growing in my chest. That night, I heard the noises again, louder this time. It wasn't just rustling. It sounded like someone dragging something across the ground outside. I turned off all the lights and stood by the window. I couldn't see anything. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to open the door. I stayed awake for most of the night, holding a kitchen knife I had grabbed just in case. In the morning, the marks in the dirt were worse. Deep scratches along the side of the cabin. Something had been there. I walked around the entire place. There were new disturbances near the trees, like something had moved through the brush. I even found one of my trash bags dragged out into the woods, torn open. That convinced me it was an animal, maybe a bear. I cleaned up what I could, made noise while I worked, and hoped whatever it was would stay away now that it knew I was around. But that night, I realized it wasn't a bear. It was around 1 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of the doorknob rattling. I lay still in bed, holding my breath. It was slow at first, a soft clinking sound. Then it got louder, like someone was trying to turn it, pull it, maybe force it open. I stayed frozen. I didn't even want to move to grab my flashlight. The rattling stopped after a while, but then I heard something even worse. Footsteps. Human footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and steady. They stopped just outside the door. Then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I opened the door and looked outside. No one was there. The ground showed no clear footprints, but the doorknob had scratches on it. Deep ones, like someone had used a key or a tool trying to unlock it. I wanted to leave right then, pack up and go home. But the thought of driving down that dirt road alone, not knowing what was out there, didn't make me feel any safer. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe some hunter or hiker got lost and tried to find shelter. Maybe they left once they realized the place was occupied. But even that didn't sit right with me. No one should have been out here. The cabin wasn't listed on any public sites. It was rented through a private host. and I hadn't seen a single other person since I arrived. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I stayed hidden in bed with the blankets pulled up, holding the knife again. I heard movement outside around midnight. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Heavy breathing right outside the window near the bed. I could barely hear it, but I knew what it was. It stayed there for a long time. Then it moved around the cabin slowly. No sounds of walking, just the noise of breath. I didn't move until the sun came up. I was stiff, cold, and terrified. I looked out the window and didn't see anything, but I was done. I packed my things, threw everything into my car, and decided to leave. When I got in the car and started the engine, I felt some relief. But as I began driving down the dirt road, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. Just for a second, person, standing at the edge of the trees watching, not moving, just watching. I kept driving. I didn't stop. The drive back to the city felt longer than it had on the way there. When I finally got cell service again, I called the host and told them I was leaving early. I didn't explain why. I just said I didn't feel well. I got home, locked all my doors, and sat on the couch for hours without moving. I felt sick, like something was still watching me, like I hadn't really left it behind. Over the next few weeks, I tried to forget about the trip. I went back to work, ignored the memories, told myself I was just tired and jumpy, that the cabin had just made me anxious from being alone. Then one morning, I found a deep scratch across my apartment door, and the next night, I heard breathing outside my window. It was late October when I decided to get away from everything for a while. Work had been a mess. Long hours, a boss who barely knew my name, and a constant stream of emails that never seemed to end. My phone never stopped buzzing. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks. I felt like a machine, waking up, grinding through my day, collapsing into bed, and doing it all over again. I needed space. I needed quiet. I needed something real. So I found a cabin. It was listed online, buried deep in the search results. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, wood-burning stove, a little deck out front. It was up north, about 4 hours from the city, and surrounded by thick forest. No Wi-Fi, no phone service, just a lake nearby, some hiking trails, and the sound of wind through the trees. The kind of place where the world couldn't find you. I booked it for 8 nights. I figured a week would be enough time to get my head straight. The drive up was long, winding through little towns and empty roads that slowly turned into gravel. The last 15 miles were just dirt, cutting through endless pine forest. I didn't pass a single car once I got off the main road. No gas stations, no stores, nothing. It felt like driving into another world. When I finally reached the cabin, I had to stop the car and just sit there for a second. It was perfect. The trees came right up to the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. The wood was dark with age, the roof thick with moss, and there were dry leaves scattered all over the small porch. It looked like no one had been there in months. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was hit with the smell of old wood and stone. The inside was even better than I'd expected. Simple, just a big room with a bed on one side and a sitting area on the other. A small kitchen tucked in the back, a wood stove near the center, and windows that looked out at the woods. There was no TV, just a battery-powered radio, a bookshelf with some dusty novels, and a few tools by the door. Everything was quiet, dead quiet, not even birds. I unpacked my stuff, mostly clothes, some dry food, a cooler with perishables, and a few basic tools in case anything broke. I had brought a hunting knife too, more out of habit than anything else. I wasn't expecting to run into trouble. The first 2 days were uneventful. I settled into a slow rhythm. I'd wake up early, make coffee on the little propane stove, eat oatmeal, then go walking. The forest was dense and felt untouched. Every path felt like it hadn't seen another person in years. Sometimes I'd just sit on a rock and listen to the wind or watch the clouds move. The silence was strange at first, but I got used to it quickly. Started to feel like the world had finally let me go. By the 3rd day, I stopped checking my phone for a signal, stayed dead. I took long walks, chopped firewood, read half a novel. I started sleeping better too, really sleeping like I hadn't in years. The only thing that bothered me was how early it got dark. By 6:30, the trees outside turned black. No streetlights, no glow from towns, just darkness, thick and full. I kept the curtains shut at night. Something about those trees after dark made me uneasy. I told myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't until the fourth night that something changed. I had just finished dinner, some canned chili and bread, and was sitting near the stove, staring at the flames. It was cold out and the heat felt good. The radio was playing softly, but the signal kept cutting in and out. That's when I heard it. A sound outside, just a quick crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. At first, I figured it was an animal. There were deer in the woods, maybe a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer. 2 slow steps. Crunch, crunch. I froze. My body tensed up before I even had a chance to think. The fire crackled behind me. I stood slowly, moved to the nearest window, and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. I waited, not breathing. Still nothing. I told myself it was nothing, but something didn't sit right. The steps were heavy, too heavy for a small animal. But I didn't hear them again, so I went back to my seat and told myself to stop being paranoid. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. The ground was covered in pine needles and dead leaves. I didn't find anything out of place, no tracks, no broken branches. I kept telling myself it was in my head, that I was just adjusting to the isolation. Still, I started keeping the knife close to my bed at night. That night, it happened again, but worse. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. Crunch, crunch, 2 slow steps, then nothing. I sat up, heart pounding. Then another 2 steps, closer. I got out of bed and crept to the window. This time, I didn't move the curtain. I just waited. Then I saw it. A man. He was standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, half hidden behind a trunk. Just standing there, still as stone. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him, tall, broad shoulders, wearing something dark. I stood there for what felt like an hour. He didn't move, neither did I. Eventually, I backed away, locked the door, and grabbed the knife. I sat near the stove all night with the fire burning, staring at the window. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I rushed outside. There was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I didn't leave. I don't know why. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I didn't want to admit that the trip wasn't going the way I'd hoped. I told myself it could have been a hunter. Maybe someone just got lost. Maybe it was nothing. But I knew that wasn't true. Each night after that, I heard him. Sometimes just once or twice. Sometimes walking all the way around the cabin. Always slow. Always just close enough that I couldn't see him unless I looked through the window at the right time. I never did again. I never saw him clearly, but I felt him, watching. I stopped going on walks. I spent my days near the cabin, chopping wood, trying to stay busy. I kept the fire going constantly and always had the knife on me. I stopped reading. I couldn't focus. I barely ate. By the 6th night, I was falling apart. My hands shook constantly. My mouth was always dry. Every sound made me jump. And that night, I heard the door handle move. Just once. A soft rattle. I was lying in bed with my knife in my hand, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A click like someone gently testing the lock. I bolted upright, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door, not turning it on. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then a slow drag of footsteps moving away. Not into the woods, but around the side of the cabin. I stayed frozen there for what felt like forever. Then I moved to the window, pulled back the curtain just a crack. I didn't see him, but I saw something worse. Footprints. Deep ones in the soft earth below the window. Someone had stood there, just inches from the glass, staring in. That was it. I was done. I waited until sunrise, packed my things, and loaded the car. I left the cabin exactly the way I found it. As I backed out of the clearing, I looked at the trees one last time, and there he was, standing at the edge of the woods, exactly where I saw him before. In full daylight now. He didn't move. He didn't run. He just stood there, watching. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, 2 hours away. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't even look back. Weeks passed, then months. I tried to forget, tried to believe it was just some backwoods drifter or a hunter who got curious. But I know better. I felt it. That wasn't curiosity. That was patience. That was watching, waiting. I never went back. I never will. I called the rental company once just to see. The listing was gone, removed, no explanation. And I still think about those footsteps at night. How soft they were, how slow, and how close they came. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed with the lights off, I swear I can hear them again. Crunch, crunch, like he found me, like he never really left. It was late September when I finally decided to isolate myself in the woods to finish writing my book. I had been putting it off for months. Every time I sat down to work on it at home, something came up. Noisy neighbors, deliveries, emails, social media, and my own distractions. I couldn't focus. I needed complete silence and no internet. Somewhere far from everything, I found a cabin listed on a small site for short-term rentals. It wasn't on Airbnb. Some guy had listed it on a forum for writers and artists. The place was deep in the woods of northern Montana. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. One bedroom, wood stove, small kitchen, and a desk that faced the forest. The photos looked perfect. Simple, quiet. He said it was solar-powered with a gas generator as backup. There was even a hand-pumped well outside for water. I booked it for a full month and paid in advance. The drive from my home in Idaho took around 9 hours. By the time I reached the logging road that led to the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The dirt road was narrow and rough. Thick trees pressed in on both sides. My car bounced over rocks and potholes. I had printed directions since GPS wouldn't work there. The road twisted for what felt like miles before I finally saw the small wooden cabin tucked into a clearing. I parked a few yards away and just sat in my car for a minute. The silence was deep. No traffic, no hum of power lines. Just trees creaking in the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. I could smell pine and damp earth. The cabin was exactly like the photos. Small, made from weathered wood with a metal roof. No signs of anyone around. I stepped out, stretched, and walked over to the front steps. There was a key waiting under a rock, just like the owner said. Inside was even simpler than I expected. A wood stove near the center, a cot with wool blankets, a shelf with a few canned goods and matches, and a big, sturdy desk that faced a wide window looking out into the forest. No curtains, no distractions, just trees and sky. I lit a few candles, checked the backup generator, tested the hand pump outside. Everything worked. That night, I boiled some canned chili, ate it slowly, and fell asleep early. I left the window shutters open so I could wake up with the light. I felt peaceful, really peaceful. The next few days went by quietly. I wrote for hours during the day, sometimes even forgetting to eat. The silence helped me focus in a way I hadn't felt in years. At night, I'd read by candlelight or sit outside on the steps, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the distant calls of owls or coyotes. Once I even saw a deer pass through the clearing. On the 5th day, something small changed. I noticed footprints outside the cabin early in the morning. They were faint, almost erased by wind, but definitely not mine. I had only gone out to the well and back. These tracks came from the woods, circled the cabin once, and disappeared back into the trees. They weren't boot prints either, more like bare feet. I stood there staring at them for a while. It made me feel strange. Not scared exactly, but something felt off. I didn't see anything else that day. I wrote for a few hours, kept the wood stove going, and tried to put it out of my head. Maybe an animal? But no, the prints had toes and a heel. I went to bed uneasy. The next morning, I found one of my firewood stacks knocked over. Nothing big. Could have been wind. But the pile had been neat before. Now the logs were scattered as if someone had been rummaging through them. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds. That day I didn't write. I kept glancing out the window. Every time the trees swayed, I froze. At one point I thought I saw movement deep in the woods. Just a shadow slipping between trunks. But it could have been wind or a deer. That night, I bolted the door and slept with a hunting knife beside the cot. I brought it just in case. It made me feel a little better, but I kept waking up. I thought I heard something outside. A light crunch of leaves, a stick snapping. Each time I held my breath, straining to hear more, but nothing followed. The next day, I walked a wide circle around the cabin. I found a few more prints, bare feet again, scattered and half erased in the undergrowth. I followed them for a bit until they disappeared. I felt exposed, like something had been circling the cabin at night. I started locking the shutters at sunset and keeping the fire low to avoid too much light. I only used the generator for short bursts. I didn't want to draw attention. A week in, I had written barely anything new. My focus was gone. I spent most of my time listening, watching, thinking. I started counting the hours until sunrise, then until sunset. I only left the cabin when I had to get water or firewood. I kept the knife in my hand when I did. One night, I was sitting at the desk, looking out the window into the dark forest. The moon was full, and the clearing was pale with light. I thought I saw someone, just for a second. A figure at the edge of the trees. Not moving, not walking, just standing, watching. I stood up slowly. The candle flickered behind me. I felt cold all over. I stared at the spot for what felt like an hour. The figure didn't move, but then I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I found deep footprints in the dirt where I thought I had seen the figure. They weren't bare this time. Heavy boots. They had tread marks. Big too. Bigger than mine. That meant two things. One, there were definitely people out there. And two, they weren't the same ones leaving the bare footprints. I tried to tell myself maybe there was a hunter in the woods. But hunters don't walk up to cabins and stand silently at night. They don't leave without saying anything. I thought about leaving, but the road was long and rough. I was hours from town. My car wasn't great on bad roads. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the prints were old. Maybe I imagined the figure. That night I heard knocking. Not on the door. Not loud. A soft tap on the wall near the window. I held my breath and sat up. The fire was almost out. I didn't move. Then another tap. Just two. Then silence. I sat there all night with my back against the wall and the knife in my hand. I didn't sleep. I decided the next morning I would leave. I packed everything into my bag, grabbed my laptop, and got ready to head out. But the car wouldn't start. I turned the key and got nothing. Not even a click. I opened the hood and checked what I could. But I don't know much about engines. Nothing looked wrong. I walked back into the cabin and sat at the desk. That's when I noticed something new. A single twig, cleanly snapped, placed carefully on the windowsill outside. Just one, like it had been put there for me to find. It wasn't there earlier that morning. I stayed inside the rest of the day. Didn't light the fire. Didn't pump water. I had one bottle left. That night, the tapping came back. Louder. 3 taps. Then 4. Then nothing. Then 1 tap near the door. I stayed awake again, heart pounding. I started to realize something. The taps weren't random. They were moving, around the cabin, like someone was walking the perimeter and tapping as they went. I waited until dawn and then left on foot. I locked the cabin behind me and walked fast, sticking to the dirt road. I didn't look into the trees. I didn't stop. I walked for nearly 5 hours until I reached a ranger station I had passed on the drive-in. The place was locked, but a ranger showed up an hour later. He looked surprised to see me. He asked how long I'd been out there. I told him where I'd been staying. His face changed. He asked if I had seen anything strange. I said yes. He told me I wasn't the first to report it, that several people who had rented that cabin over the last few years had left early. One didn't even take his things. Another never returned the key. Nobody had been hurt, but they all mentioned the same things. Barefoot prints, tapping, silent figures in the trees. They never found who was doing it. I rode with the ranger back to my car. He jump-started it with his truck. It worked fine. Nothing wrong with it. I didn't go back for the rest of my things. I finished the book at home. I wrote faster than I ever had before. I didn't include anything about what happened in the cabin. It wasn't part of the story. But sometimes, when I sit alone in my office, I swear I hear tapping. Just once, then nothing, probably in my head. But I never leave my windows open anymore. I never liked being around too many people. Crowded places made my head buzz, like there was too much noise all at once, even when no one was saying anything. I worked a regular job in the city, nothing exciting, warehouse inventory. Most of my day was spent walking around with a scanner in my hand, checking barcodes. It paid the bills, and it kept me from sitting still too long, which I preferred. But by the time the holidays rolled around in early December, I felt like I couldn't take one more day in that giant metal building. I needed to get out, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. That's how I ended up booking a small off-grid cabin deep in northern Michigan. It wasn't through one of those big rental sites. It was some local guy I found through a small forum. He said he built the place himself back in the 80s. Said there was no cell signal, no power, no plumbing, but it had a wood stove, a bed, and a locked front door. It sounded perfect. I packed up my truck with enough food, water, firewood, and gear to last me 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just that I'd be out of town. It wasn't because I wanted to disappear. I just liked being left alone. I'd done backwoods camping trips before. This was nothing new. The drive was long and slow. Most of the roads were half covered in snow. By the time I got near the turnoff road, it was already getting dark. I followed the directions exactly, winding through thick woods and bumpy logging trails until I saw the little sign nailed to a pine. Cabin written in black spray paint. An arrow pointed down a narrow trail that had tire ruts, but they looked old, like no one had driven through recently. I took it anyway. I drove slow, tires crunching over frozen mud and patches of ice. The trees pressed in tight on both sides, and the snow on the branches looked like it had never been touched. It felt like I was driving into a place that hadn't seen people in a long time. Finally, the trail opened into a small clearing. The cabin stood there, wooden, weathered, simple. No lights, of course. No porch. Just one step up to a metal door that looked newer than the rest of the place. It had 2 windows, one in the front, one in the back. That was it. Behind it, nothing but dark trees stretching into miles of forest. I turned off the truck and listened. Nothing. No wind. No animals. Just the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled down. It was peaceful. I liked it. I unloaded what I needed, got the fire going inside, and set up my sleeping bag on the small bed against the far wall. There was no mattress, just a board and a frame, but I'd brought a thick pad. I boiled some water, ate a quick meal, and climbed into the sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast. The silence helped. The first few days were calm. I didn't do much. I woke up with the sun, boiled water, ate oatmeal, split firewood, and sat outside with a thermos of coffee. Sometimes I'd walk the trails near the cabin, not going too far, just far enough to stretch my legs. The trees were thick and heavy with snow. No birds, no wind most days. I liked the stillness. Felt like the forest was sleeping. By the 4th night, I'd stopped checking my phone altogether. No signal, no reason. I liked how disconnected I felt. I sat by the stove every night, listening to the soft pop of the logs. I brought a small notebook and wrote random things, just thoughts. There were no lights outside, just the moonlight on snow. At night, it looked like the woods had a faint glow. But things started to change around the 6th day. It was little stuff at first. One morning, I woke up and noticed boot prints in the snow near the back window. At first, I thought they were mine. I had gone out to chop wood, and maybe I circled around back. But the pattern was different. The sole had a different shape, and the stride was longer. They led to the back window, then turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. I didn't hear anything the night before. No knocks, no steps, no animal noises. It had been silent, just like every other night. I told myself it was probably just a hunter, maybe someone passing through. But the tracks came too close to the cabin, too close to the window, and there were no other tracks leading up to it. No approach, just appearing near the window and then leaving. I shook it off, didn't think about it much. But that night, I locked the door with the heavy bolt and pushed one of the chairs under the handle. I kept the hatchet next to the bed, just in case. That night, I barely slept. I kept listening for noises, but nothing came. Still silence. The next morning, I walked out and checked around the cabin. No new tracks. Nothing disturbed. It was like nothing had happened. I went about my day. I read, I walked a short trail, I boiled more water. I even convinced myself the tracks were old. Maybe from the guy who maintained the cabin. Maybe he came before I arrived and I just didn't notice them. But then on the 9th day, something else happened. I went for a longer walk that morning. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I marked my trail with small ribbons I tied to branches, like I always did when hiking unfamiliar places. The path was uneven and icy in parts, but it was clear enough to follow. After about 2 hours, I reached a small ridge with a good view. Below was a frozen stream, thick woods on all sides. I stood there for a bit, eating a granola bar and drinking from my thermos. That's when I saw something that didn't belong. Across the stream, maybe 60 yards away between two trees, was a shape. A figure, not moving, just standing there. I stared at it for a long time. It was a man. I could tell by the broad shoulders and the posture. He was wearing dark clothes, maybe a jacket or hoodie. I couldn't see the details. He wasn't moving, not walking, not waving, just standing and looking toward me. I froze. I didn't wave or call out. I just watched. After maybe a minute, I turned and walked back the way I came. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I didn't look back until I reached the cabin. I didn't see anyone behind me. No movement, no sounds. Back inside, I locked the door again and pulled the curtain over the front window. My hands were shaking, but I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it was probably another hiker, or maybe a hunter, but that didn't feel right. The woods were too empty. I hadn't heard a single gunshot since I got there. No barking dogs, no distant voices. It felt like I was the only one in miles. But that guy, whoever he was, had been standing still, just watching. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire small so the cabin wouldn't glow too much through the windows. Every few hours, I got up and checked outside. Nothing moved. On the 11th day, I found more tracks. This time, they were near the front window. Same kind of boots, same pattern. They led straight to the glass and just stopped, like the guy had stood there for a long time, looking in. But I never heard a sound. Not one twig snap, not one footstep. That day, I didn't go outside. I kept the hatchet in my lap while I sat by the stove. I kept listening, waiting for something, but again, there was just silence. That night, I finally decided to leave. I started packing before it got dark. I figured I'd sleep one more night and head out before sunrise. But I never made it through that night. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound that changed everything. A single tap on the back window. Just one. Then silence. I sat up in the bed, heart pounding, staring at the wall. Then another tap. Same window. I grabbed the hatchet and walked to the front window, staying low. I peeked through the edge of the curtain. Nothing. I moved toward the back. I didn't lift the curtain, just listened. My ears were ringing from how hard my heart was beating. Then I heard it, asterisk footstep star. Slow, soft crunching over snow, circling the cabin. I stood there, not breathing. Then the doorknob jiggled. Not hard, just enough to make the metal click. Then silence. I backed away, pulled a chair under the handle, and sat down on the floor, hatchet in both hands. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just sat there, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door and walked outside. There were tracks. Clear, deep, fresh. They circled the cabin, paused at the windows, stopped at the door. Then they led off into the trees. I didn't even grab all my stuff. I shoved what I could into a bag and got in the truck. I followed the trail out, slipping a few times, almost driving off the road more than once. But I didn't stop. I didn't call the police. What would I tell them? Some guy stood near my cabin? That I heard footsteps and tapping? There was no proof. No crime. I just left and never went back. Months passed. Then one day in spring, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a small plastic bag. Inside the bag was one of the red ribbons I'd tied to a tree on my hike, and nothing else. I moved apartments the next. I don't really tell this story anymore. Not because I don't remember it well, but because people always look at me weird afterward. Like I'm either crazy or lying. But it happened, every bit of it. And I haven't stepped foot near a cabin since. It was in early October when I decided to take a solo trip up into the mountains. I was burned out from work, tired of the noise, and just wanted to get away from everything. A guy I knew from a hiking forum had once told me about a place his uncle used to own. A small off-grid cabin in Idaho, maybe 2 miles from the closest dirt road. I had asked him about it months ago, and he said it was long abandoned and nobody used it anymore. No electricity, no running water, but it was still standing. He sent me rough directions, told me where to park, and said if I was really looking to disappear for a few days, it would do the job. It took me almost 10 hours to drive out there, mostly because the last leg of it was through winding roads and then a slow drive down a barely usable dirt trail. When I finally parked near the edge of the forest and slung my pack over my shoulder, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The hike to the cabin wasn't terrible, but the directions weren't exact. I had to backtrack twice after following what looked like trails that ended up being just game paths. Eventually, after climbing over a couple of fallen logs and cutting through a thick patch of brush, I saw the outline of a roof in the clearing ahead. The cabin looked rough, but not destroyed. The door was slightly ajar, and the windows had no glass, just open squares with wooden shutters on the inside. The front porch creaked when I stepped on it, and there was a small pile of leaves and dead bugs in the corners. The place smelled like old wood and dust, but no signs of animals or anyone else. I set up quickly, unrolled my sleeping bag on the old cot inside, and started a small fire in the fire ring outside the cabin. I heated up a can of stew and sat on a flat rock, watching the last of the daylight fade into blue shadows. The air had that sharp bite of fall, and once the fire died, the cold settled in hard. That first night, I barely slept. I wasn't scared, just uncomfortable. The wind kept moving through the trees outside, and little creaks and pops in the cabin kept waking me. I remember looking at my watch at least 5 times, thinking it must almost be morning, only to see that barely an hour had passed. The second day, I spent some time walking around the area, just getting a feel for where I was. The forest was dense but quiet. I didn't see any signs of big animals, just some birds, squirrels, and one old deer print near the stream behind the cabin. I filled my bottle with water, used iodine tablets to purify it, and spent most of the afternoon cutting kindling and stacking it in a dry corner of the porch. That night, I noticed something strange. Just after dark, maybe around 8 p.m., I heard what sounded like wood knocking. 3 hard knocks, not like an axe or a tree falling, more like someone hitting a tree with a thick branch. Came from somewhere downhill behind the cabin. I sat still for a while, listening. Nothing else followed. No footsteps, no voices. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree cracking in the cold. I went to bed uneasy but slept better than the night before. The third day, I found something that made my stomach turn. I was walking near the stream again, following it a bit further than before, and saw a small tree that had been stripped of its bark. All around the base were deep gouges in the dirt, like something had clawed at the ground there. I leaned in closer. The tree itself had these strange grooves, about shoulder height, like deep scratches. But they weren't from an animal. They were too evenly spaced, too straight. It looked like someone had taken a tool, maybe a chisel, and cut into the trunk deliberately. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I kept scanning the trees. Every time I thought I saw movement, it would turn out to be a shadow or a bird. Still, I couldn't stop looking. That night was the worst so far. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, heart racing. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was silent. But then I heard it, a crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate. It was someone, or something, walking just behind the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped, then nothing. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag for what felt like an hour. Finally, I sat up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it toward the back window. I couldn't see anything. I listened hard. Still nothing. But I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I walked behind the cabin, checking the dirt for tracks. The ground was soft, and I found them quickly. A line of prints, barefoot, human. The toes were clear in the mud. No shoes, no socks, just bare feet. The prints were wide and flat. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they vanished into harder ground. I packed up everything that day. I didn't care about the rest of the food. I just wanted to get out. But I knew the hike back to the car would take a while, especially with how thick the woods were. About an hour into the hike, I stopped to drink some water and rest. I sat on a log, trying to calm down, when I saw it again. Movement. Not close, maybe 30 yards off to my left. Just behind the trees. A figure. It was there and then gone like it stepped behind a trunk. I stared, not moving, not blinking. Nothing. I started moving faster after that. I didn't care about getting scratched by branches or losing the trail. I just needed to get back to the car. I made it there just before dark. The car was untouched. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I was backing up to turn around, my headlights lit up something on the tree directly across from where I had parked. It was a symbol carved into the bark, a circle with 3 lines through it, deep grooves like with a knife or sharp rock. I had never seen it before. I didn't want to know what it meant. The drive back felt like it took a week. Every turn in the road, every sound outside the car made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've tried to forget about it. I haven't been back to the woods. I sold most of my camping gear. I stay in hotels now if I need to get away. I never told the guy from the forum what happened. I don't think he really knew what was out there. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. What I do know is this: someone else was in those woods. Someone who didn't want me there. Someone who watched me the entire time. And they never said a word. They just waited. And now, every once in a while, I still hear it. When the night is really quiet and I'm lying in bed. 3 knocks. Just 3. I rented the cabin because I thought I needed space. Not the kind of space that people usually talk about when they're going through something emotional. I mean actual physical space, silence, no traffic, no neighbors, no phones. I had been working on a freelance design project that had gone way over schedule, and I felt like my head was about to explode with all the notifications, emails, meetings, and revisions. I wanted to go somewhere I wouldn't see another person for at least a few days. That's how I found the cabin in the listing. It was an old wooden structure tucked deep in a forested area in the upper part of Michigan, about 30 minutes from the nearest gas station. The photos showed a rundown exterior, but I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for luxury. I just wanted a desk, power, running water, and some peace and quiet. The listing said it had all of that, and I paid for 5 nights in advance. I arrived late in the afternoon, sometime after 4 p.m. It had rained earlier, so the gravel road was soft and wet, and my tires kicked up mud the entire way. The road wasn't marked well. I had to drive with my GPS open the whole time, and the signal got weak about 20 minutes out. When I reached the cabin, I felt a little uneasy. It looked even older than the photos. The wood on the porch was bowed, the windows were dirty, and the door looked like it had been chewed on by animals. Still, it wasn't awful. Inside, it was dusty but livable. There was an old couch, a table, a kitchenette, and a small bedroom. The lights worked. The tap water ran brown for the first few seconds, but then cleared up. There was even a small fireplace, though I didn't plan to use it. I unloaded my gear, laptop, chargers, some food, and a few clothes. The place smelled like damp wood and dust, but again, nothing too bad. I had brought enough to get by without having to leave for the entire time. The plan was to lock myself in, focus on work, and not come out until I had made some serious progress. That first night, things already started to feel wrong. I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard a loud snap outside the window. It wasn't a small twig. It was something heavy. I sat up in bed and listened. The forest was quiet again. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a deer or a raccoon stepped on something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. My stomach felt tight for no reason. I got up, checked the front door. It was locked, and peeked out the window. Nothing, just the woods. The next day, I tried to focus. I made coffee, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. The peace and silence were almost too much. The only sounds were birds and wind. I worked for a few hours, but my mind kept drifting back to that sound I heard during the night. It didn't feel like a random forest noise. It felt close. In the afternoon, I walked around the cabin to clear my head. I noticed footprints in the soft ground. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Deep ones. Someone had walked around the cabin recently. That sent a chill down my back. I looked in every direction but didn't see anyone. The prints led from the tree line toward the cabin and stopped near the front porch. I hadn't walked around that area yet, and they were too big to be mine anyway. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for 5 nights, and I figured maybe it was the owner checking on the place before I arrived. I pushed it out of my mind, but I moved my laptop into the bedroom and worked in there with the door closed for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was softer, scraping against the wall. Came from the side of the cabin near the window. It would stop, then start again, slow and steady. I didn't move. I just laid there, heart racing, eyes wide open in the dark. I gripped the flashlight I kept beside the bed. The scraping stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin again. There were more boot prints, fresh ones. The rain had stopped a day ago, and the ground was dry except for shaded areas. The prints were newer than the ones from yesterday. I followed them slowly around the building. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. I stared at them for a long time. It didn't make sense. There was no vehicle nearby. Whoever was walking around wasn't driving up to the cabin. They were coming through the forest. There was no cell service to call anyone, but I had an offline map. The closest town was almost 30 miles out, and there was no house or lodge anywhere nearby. That's when I started to realize this wasn't random. Someone was watching the cabin. I made a stupid decision that day. I stayed. I told myself maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe the prints were old. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to me. I told myself all the things that people tell themselves when they're trying to avoid doing the smart thing. I didn't want to pack everything up and waste the trip. So I locked the doors, closed the curtains, and tried to work. I kept the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen beside me all day. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept glancing out the window every few minutes. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps on the porch around 1 a.m. Not animals, not wind. I know what human footsteps sound like on wood, and that's what I heard. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was pacing or waiting. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't turn on the lights. I laid there in the dark, heart pounding so hard I felt like I was going to pass out. Then I heard the doorknob turn. It jiggled softly, then harder. I held my breath. I wanted to scream, but I stayed quiet. The door was locked, but I didn't know how strong it was. I had no way to defend myself other than a kitchen knife. The jiggling stopped. Then came the scraping again, this time at the window. Slow, long scratches along the glass. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, it went silent. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I must have because I woke up at dawn. The sunlight was barely coming through the trees, and I jumped out of bed, ran to the window, and saw nothing. but the porch had mud on it. Footprints. Whoever was out there had stood at the door for a long time. Maybe even looked through the window. I didn't bother checking the rest of the perimeter. I packed everything up in a hurry, threw my clothes into the duffel. I didn't care if my food spilled in the bag. I shoved everything into the back of the car. But the car wouldn't start. I turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. The lights on the dashboard were dead. I opened the hood, looked at the battery. It looked fine, but I wasn't a mechanic. All I knew was that it wasn't working. The battery was probably drained. I stood there in the gravel driveway, staring at the empty road. There were no houses nearby, no signal on my phone. I had no way to call for help. I made another bad decision. I stayed one more night. I blocked the door with the table and chairs. I put everything in front of it I could move. I pushed the couch against the inside wall under the window. I kept the knife with me. I kept the flashlight on the pillow next to me. And I didn't sleep. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard it again. This time it came from the back of the cabin, scratching, slow and steady. Then footsteps on the gravel. Not one person, two, maybe three. I didn't dare look out the window. I just laid there, heart beating out of my chest, every muscle locked in place. The footsteps moved around the cabin. They stopped. Then I heard them on the porch again. The door rattled. The doorknob turned hard this time. Then something hit the door. Not a kick, but a hard push. The table inside wobbled. I sat up and gripped the knife. I felt sick. I wanted to throw up. I thought they were going to break the door down. Then silence. It stayed silent until dawn. When the sun finally came up, I walked outside. There were footprints again, fresh ones, and something new. On the window, someone had smeared something. A handprint. It wasn't blood. It looked like mud or something darker, but it was smeared in the shape of a hand, right in the center of the glass. That was it. I wasn't staying another second. I grabbed my backpack, shoved in water, and left everything else. I walked. I followed the road for hours. My legs hurt. My throat was dry. I saw no cars.
No cabins.
Nothing. After about 6 hours, I finally got a bar of signal. Just one. I texted my brother. Then I collapsed under a tree and waited. He found me 2 hours later with a spare battery and jumper cables. I didn't go back for my things. I told him to just drive. I didn't even look behind me. The police weren't much help. They said no signs of forced entry, no damage, no real evidence. They said maybe it was hunters or teenagers messing around. I knew better. Someone had been watching that cabin, waiting. I still don't know what they wanted, but I know I was being watched the whole time. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. That cabin still shows up online sometimes. Same photos, same listing, no reviews, still cheap. I always wonder if someone else has rented it since, but I'll never go back. I had been working as a freelance photographer for over 10 years, and most of that time had been spent in cities. Crowded streets, buzzing lights, loud people, and constant movement. I was burned out. I needed quiet, and more than that, I needed space. So, when my cousin mentioned his old cabin up near the Canadian border in northern Montana, a place he hadn't used in years, I didn't hesitate. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted, that it had power, a wood stove, a working well, and satellite internet if I needed it. But what drew me in the most was how isolated it was. He wasn't exaggerating. The cabin was about a 40-minute drive from the closest town, a 2-hour drive from the closest hospital, and surrounded by miles of woods in every direction. There were no neighbors nearby, no passing cars, no noise except the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. It sat in a small clearing just inside a valley, with a dense tree line about 50 yards from the front porch. You could see the trees stretch out forever, crawling up the hills in every direction. It was beautiful. I arrived in mid-September. The weather was cool, but not cold. The days were short, the nights quiet. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent time cleaning the place up, organizing supplies, and taking long walks in the woods. The trails around the cabin weren't marked, but I was careful. I always noted landmarks and took my GPS with me just in case. I'd wake up around 6, make coffee, sit on the porch and listen. No car horns, no people yelling, just wind and the occasional rustle in the bushes. I felt like I could breathe again. About a week in, I noticed something strange. It was small at first. One morning, I found a boot print about 30 yards from the cabin. It wasn't mine. I'd been wearing a different type of boot. The print was older, maybe a few days, but it was deep and clear. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone passing through. The second thing was a bird. A large raven, I think. I had seen it a few times earlier in the week. It would sit on the same branch on a tree near the cabin and just watch. It didn't fly off when I walked near it. It didn't move when I made noise. Just sat there staring. I brushed it off. Probably nothing. Birds are weird sometimes. Then things started happening more frequently. Little things. One night, I left a small folding chair on the porch. When I woke up, it was gone. I found it later about 20 feet into the woods, folded and leaning against a tree. I didn't do that. I told myself maybe I was tired and had forgotten. Maybe the wind blew it there somehow, though that made no sense. A few days later, I noticed scratch marks on the side of the cabin near the back window. 3 long, thin scratches. Too low to be from a bear or cat. Too sharp to be from a branch swaying in the wind. I checked the area. Nothing. Just the same quiet woods. I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. I wasn't used to this much silence. Maybe it was getting to me. Then came the night I heard footsteps. It was about 2 a.m. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard them, slow, crunching in the dead leaves outside the window near the front of the cabin. I froze. My eyes were wide open, and my heart felt like it had stopped. The sound kept going for maybe 20 seconds. Crunch, pause, then silence. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. I didn't sleep a second. When it was light, I went outside. There were faint prints, too shallow to be fresh, but they were there, leading from the tree line to the porch and then veering off around the side. I walked the perimeter. No sign of anything else. After that, I stopped sleeping well. I started double-checking all the locks. I moved a heavy dresser in front of the back door. I kept a knife on the nightstand and a flashlight next to it. I considered leaving. I had enough material for my portfolio. I could pack up and be gone in 2 hours. But I kept telling myself it was probably just animals. I hadn't seen another person in days. Maybe I was just getting too paranoid. But then something happened that changed everything. It was early October. The leaves were turning, and the temperature had dropped. I had started building small fires in the stove in the mornings and evenings. On this particular night, I had made stew and was reading when the power suddenly went out. Total darkness. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and checked the breaker. It was fine. The generator still had fuel. I went outside, checked the box, the wires. Nothing seemed broken. I reset everything. Still no power. That was when I noticed something. The folding chair was back, sitting in the middle of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from the porch. This time it was open, facing the cabin. I froze. It hadn't been there earlier. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight. My hands were shaking. Nothing, just trees. I went back inside and locked everything. I lit some candles and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, facing the door. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I packed a bag. I was going to leave. I told myself I'd had enough. Whatever was going on wasn't worth it. I could find peace somewhere else. But my car wouldn't start. It had been working fine the day before. It was a basic SUV, nothing fancy, but reliable. Now, it didn't even click. The battery was dead. I opened the hood. Nothing seemed wrong. No corrosion, no broken parts. I checked the cables. Still nothing. Completely dead. It made no sense. I didn't have cell signal up there. The only internet came through the satellite dish, which was now down because the power was out. And the nearest town was a long hike away, over 20 miles. I could make it, but not in one day. I told myself I'd go at first light. That night was worse than any before. Around midnight, I heard tapping on the back window, just 3 soft taps. I didn't move, then silence for about an hour, then footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. I could hear them right outside the door. No knocking, no voice, just the slow weight of boots on wood. I held the knife so tight my hand hurt. Then they were gone. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I grabbed my bag, water, and the emergency flare gun and started walking. I stuck to the logging road that led into the forest from the south. It was rough, barely used, and overgrown, but it was the only way I knew. I kept moving all day, didn't stop, ate trail mix as I walked, drank water sparingly. My legs were sore by midday, my back ached, but I kept going. I finally reached the ranger station at dusk. It was closed, but I banged on the door until someone came out. I didn't explain everything, just that my car died, the power went out, and I needed help. A ranger named Daniel drove me back the next day. We reached the cabin around noon. The door was open. I hadn't left it that way. Inside, things were moved. The dresser was pushed aside. My bag was gone. My knife was on the floor. The stew pot was sitting in the middle of the living room, empty and clean. The chair was gone too. We found my car had power again. Nothing wrong with the battery. Nothing at all. I didn't stay another night. I left that same day and never went back. I didn't report anything to the police. What could I say? That someone had maybe been watching me for weeks? That they tapped on windows and moved chairs? That they somehow killed and revived a car battery? They'd laugh at me. I never found out who it was. Maybe just a drifter. Maybe someone who lived in the woods. Maybe they didn't like me being there. Maybe it was just a game to them. All I know is this: I've never felt fear like I did in that cabin. Not because of ghosts or demons or monsters, but because someone real was out there. Someone quiet, patient, and close enough to watch me, day and night. And I never saw their face. That's what keeps me up sometimes. Just knowing that, somewhere in those woods, behind those trees, someone was always watching. And they're probably still out there, waiting for the next person to come alone. It was early October when I decided to take a break from everything and stay in a remote cabin in the northern part of Minnesota. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, barely eating right, and feeling like everything in life had just become noise. I didn't want anyone with me. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just needed quiet. I found the place online. It was a single-story log cabin tucked deep in the forest near a lake. The owner said it had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and spotty cell service, which to me sounded perfect. I booked it for 10 days. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning, passed through small towns, gas stations with rusted signs, and stretches of highway with barely a car in sight. By the time I got off the main road and onto the gravel path leading to the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The air felt colder, and everything around me looked like it had been frozen in time. No other cabins nearby, just trees, pine needles, the crackle of leaves in the wind. Felt lonely but peaceful. The cabin itself looked old but well-maintained, with stacked neatly near the front door. A porch swing hung to the side, creaking slightly as the breeze picked up. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchen with an old propane stove, a couch that had definitely seen better days, a wood-burning fireplace, and one bedroom in the back with a creaky double bed. The walls were lined with old hunting photos, fish plaques, and some dusty books stacked on a shelf. Everything smelled like firewood, dust, and time. I unpacked slowly, put my food in the small fridge that ran off propane, and lit a fire. That night, the silence was so thick it almost had weight. I sat on the porch in a jacket, just listening. No cars, no voices, just the sound of branches swaying and the occasional bird. I slept hard that first night, the kind of sleep where you wake up not knowing what day or time it is. The first few days went well. I read books, hiked through the woods, cooked simple meals. I started to feel normal again, clear-headed, the kind of peace I had been needing. But around the 5th day, something changed. It was small at first. I woke up and found the firewood stack had been moved. Not by a lot, but it looked like someone had tried to take some. I thought maybe an animal had knocked it over, but there were no tracks. Just the wood, slightly shifted, not how I left it. That same day, while I was out hiking a familiar trail that looped around the lake, I noticed footprints. At first I thought they were mine from earlier in the week, but they were fresher and headed in a direction I hadn't walked. They disappeared into a dense part of the woods. I stood there for a while, trying to see if anyone else was around. Nothing, just quiet trees. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something on the porch. Once I thought I heard soft footsteps. Not animal sounds, human steps. Slow, deliberate. I turned on the lights, grabbed the old axe from the fireplace tools, and checked every window. Nothing, no one, just the wind. The next day I decided to hike a different trail, one that went higher into the ridge above the lake. I wanted to get a better view, maybe clear my head again. On my way up, I found something strange. A small pile of bones, clean, picked bare, laid out neatly in a circle. Probably an animal, but it didn't look like it had been left by another animal. It looked arranged. I didn't touch it. I just turned around and headed back. That night, it felt like the cabin was pressing in around me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was isolated and my brain was making shadows out of nothing. But then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps again, this time on the porch. I turned off the lights and stood by the window holding the axe. I watched and waited. There was no moon, just darkness. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, just standing near the edge of the woods, close enough to make out the outline. Not moving, just watching. My heart was pounding. I stayed at the window for almost an hour. It never moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a tree or some weird trick of light. I went to bed with the axe next to me. In the morning, I found something that changed everything. Near the edge of the porch was a boot print. Fresh, definitely human, not mine. I had only brought hiking boots with a very different tread. This one was smooth-soled, like a work boot. Someone had been there. I packed some food, took my small knife and the axe, and decided to hike into the direction I had seen the figure. I hiked for hours, calling out occasionally. No one. But then I found something. Deep in the woods, hidden behind brush, was what looked like a makeshift camp. Old tarps, empty cans, a small fire pit long since cold, and something worse, scraps of clothes, dirty, torn. Some looked like they had dried blood. I didn't stay long. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. I never leave it open. I stood still for a long time, listening. I went in slow. Everything looked the same, but I noticed something right away. The axe I had left by the bed was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I barricaded the door with the small kitchen table and sat in the corner with the knife. I kept all the lights off and tried to be as quiet as possible. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement. A branch snapping, a soft thud, then silence. Nothing else the rest of the night. The next morning, I grabbed everything I could carry and hiked out. I didn't take the road. I cut straight through the forest using the GPS on my phone. Battery was almost dead. I kept moving fast, ignoring the pain in my legs. I didn't stop. When I reached the road, I flagged down the first truck I saw. The guy looked at me like I was insane, but he gave me a ride into town. I reported everything to the local sheriff. They went out to check the cabin. A week later, I got a call. They said they found signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby, probably for a long time. They found the camp, found the bones too, said they were animal, not human, but they never found the axe, or the person. I never went back to the cabin. I never finished the last 2 days I had paid for. I didn't ask for a refund. I just wanted to forget it, but I still think about it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear footsteps again. That same slow, heavy step on old wood. I tell myself it's just the wind, just a dream, but deep down I know someone was out there, watching me, waiting. It started with an online ad. I was scrolling late one night, looking for a quiet place to get away for a few days. I'd been feeling burned out. My job had turned into a mess. My sleep was getting worse, and I needed some time alone to clear my head. The ad was simple: a cabin in the mountains, isolated, fully stocked, cheap, almost too cheap. But I didn't think too hard about that. I booked it the same night. The drive up was long. It took almost 6 hours from the city, and the last 2 hours were on narrow, curvy roads that snaked up through thick forest. There were no signs, just a set of GPS coordinates and vague instructions emailed by the owner. I followed them exactly. Cell signal dropped halfway up the mountain. The trees were thick, blocking the sun even in the afternoon. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already getting dark. It was an old wooden place, nothing fancy. One floor, a wraparound porch, and a view of the valley that would have been beautiful if not for the heavy gray clouds settling low over the trees. It looked like a place someone once cared about but hadn't maintained in years. The windows were dusty, the wood siding was starting to rot in places, and there was a faint smell of dampness when I stepped inside. Still, it was warm and had electricity. That was enough for me. The inside was cleaner than I expected. There was a main room with a small kitchen and a sitting area, a bedroom with a double bed, and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink and an old shower. A small closet near the entrance held some cleaning supplies and tools. It had everything I needed. I unpacked quickly and tried to settle in. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I'm used to the hum of city life, cars, voices, traffic, but here there was nothing. Just wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the old wooden frame. I tried to sleep early but ended up tossing and turning most of the night. Every little noise had me opening my eyes. My body tensed. I kept telling myself I was being stupid. It was just a new place. I wasn't used to this kind of silence. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There was an old trail that started behind the cabin. The trees were thick, towering pines mixed with clusters of oak and dense undergrowth. I followed the trail for about a mile before it started to vanish. Branches blocked the path. It looked like no one had walked it in years. Still, I kept going, pushing past the brush until I came across an old metal fence. It was about 5 feet tall and rusted through in places. Beyond it, the forest looked darker, like the trees grew closer together. I didn't climb it. Something about it made me uneasy. Instead, I marked the spot on my offline map and turned back. When I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I made a simple dinner and sat on the porch as the sky turned orange and the trees cast long shadows over the clearing. For a moment, I felt calm. That night was different. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps on the wooden porch. My body went still. I didn't move, just lay there listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but there was nothing. I got up, crept to the window, and peeked outside. The porch was empty. The woods were dark. I stood there for a while, staring out into the trees, heart pounding. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went back to bed. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was wet from the night's dew, and I found faint impressions near the back steps. They were human, barefoot. The toes and heel were clearly visible in the mud. The prints led toward the woods and vanished after a few feet. I didn't know what to think. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night. I checked my phone, still no service. I thought about leaving, but I'd already paid for 4 nights, and the idea of packing everything up and driving down those roads in a panic didn't sit right with me. I decided to stay, but I kept the axe from the woodpile inside with me from then on. The third night was worse. It started with tapping. Soft, rhythmic tapping on the bedroom window. I stayed in bed, frozen. The tapping kept going. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, I heard the porch steps creak again. This time, the footsteps were faster, moving back and forth. Then came scratching on the back door. Not hard, just enough to be heard. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed with the axe across my lap until the sun rose. As soon as it was light, I went outside. Again, no one there. More footprints, this time circling the cabin. still barefoot, still heading back into the woods. I was done. I packed everything up and loaded the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. The road down was rougher than I remembered. At one point, I had to stop and clear a fallen branch. When I got back into the car, I noticed something on the windshield. A handprint. A clear, muddy handprint right in the center of the glass. I hadn't seen it before. That drive felt longer than any other drive I've taken in my life. I didn't feel safe until I hit pavement and saw other cars again. I checked into a motel that night, somewhere with lights, people, and cell service. I didn't sleep much there either, but at least I wasn't alone in the middle of nowhere. A few days later, I tried to look up the cabin listing again. The ad was gone. I checked my email for the confirmation and the messages from the owner. They were gone too. Deleted. I know I didn't delete them. I even called the site I booked through. They had no record of the listing. I don't know what happened up there. I've tried to move on. I haven't gone back to the mountains since. I keep the axe in my apartment now by the bed. It's probably overkill, but it helps me sleep. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and think I hear footsteps outside, but I tell myself it's just the city noise, and I never, ever open the window. I've always liked being alone in quiet places. I don't need much, just a place where I can sit, read, think, and stay away from people for a while. Life gets loud. Phones ringing, traffic, office noise, texts, meetings. Sometimes I just need a break. That's why I rented that cabin. It was late October when I took time off work. I had 5 days to myself. I found the place on a website that lists private rentals, the kind of place where owners let you use their cabins for a fee. This one looked perfect. It was small, tucked deep in the woods of northern Idaho. A narrow dirt road led to it miles off any highway. There were no neighbors, no cell service, no internet. That was part of the appeal. The listing described it as rustic but comfortable. It had a wood stove, running water, a bed, a generator for lights, and a deck that looked out over a small lake. The pictures showed a cozy interior with rough timber walls, a table and chairs, a narrow kitchen with a propane stove, and a cot in the corner under a small window. I arrived in the afternoon, just before the sun dipped behind the tree line. The last few miles of road were rough with rocks and ruts, but my old Jeep made it. The air was crisp and dry, with that sharp bite you feel just before real winter starts. The cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pine and spruce. The lake was visible through the trees maybe 100 feet downhill. The surface was still, and there was no wind. I turned off the Jeep, stepped out, and just stood there for a while. No sound except the crunch of my boots on dry pine needles. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, smoke, and something faintly musty. Not bad, just old. Lived in. A few mouse droppings in the corners, but that's normal out here. I swept a little, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and checked the generator. It ran fine. There was a metal drum outside to collect rainwater, which fed into the small sink in the kitchen. The outhouse was about 30 feet from the back door. I brought enough food for the week: cans, jerky, oatmeal, stuff that didn't need refrigeration. I also had a good flashlight, an extra battery pack, a first aid kit, and my hunting knife. I wasn't planning to go far from the cabin, but I liked being prepared. That first night was quiet. I made tea on the propane stove and read until the light from the generator started to flicker. I turned it off, used my flashlight to get ready for bed, and lay down on the cot. The silence was deep, not even crickets, just the creak of wood and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. No sound, no light, just that feeling like something had changed. I couldn't explain it. I lay there for a while, eyes wide, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next day, I hiked a bit around the lake. There was an old trail that circled it, mostly overgrown. I followed it halfway, then cut back through the woods toward the cabin. I found some animal tracks in the mud by the water, probably raccoon or maybe a fox. I spent most of the day reading, whittling a stick I found, and watching the wind make ripples on the lake. That night, I made a small fire in the pit outside and sat by it until the stars came out. I kept hearing little snapping sounds in the woods, probably squirrels or branches falling, but it kept making me turn my head. On the third day, things started feeling strange. I woke up early, around 6 a.m., and stepped outside to relieve myself. There were boot prints near the side of the cabin. Not mine. Mine went from the door to the outhouse and back, and I always walked in the same place. These were fresh, maybe from last night. They came from the woods, went toward the side window, and then disappeared back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time. The shape was odd, big, but narrow, like someone with long feet or wearing thin boots. I followed the prints a few steps into the trees, but the forest floor was mostly pine needles, so the trail faded quickly. I tried to tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter, but it didn't make sense. This place was private land, and why would someone come to the window at night? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go for a hike. I kept the door locked when I was inside. I brought my knife everywhere with me, even just out to the outhouse. I kept checking over my shoulder, even though I saw nothing. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises. Not loud, just soft, shuffling sounds. I'd shine the flashlight through the window, but the beam didn't reach far. Too many trees. Every time I turned it off, I felt like something was out there, just beyond where I could see. On the fourth morning, I found the generator had been turned off. I always turned it on in the morning and off before bed, just to save fuel. But this time, it was switched off when I went to use it. I checked the fuel line. Nothing wrong. Someone had flipped the switch. I kept looking around. Still no one. The forest was the same. Quiet, windless, heavy with silence. I started thinking maybe I should leave early. I only had one night left, but something felt wrong, like I was being watched. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the lake again to try to clear my head. I sat on a log and tried to calm down. That's when I saw something across the water. On the opposite side of the lake, maybe 200 yards away, there was a figure, standing still. It was tall, very tall, wearing dark clothes or maybe just all covered in shadow. Couldn't make out details, just the shape of someone standing at the edge of the trees. They weren't walking, just standing. I stared. I didn't move. For maybe a minute, nothing happened. Then they turned slowly and disappeared into the trees. I walked fast, almost ran back to the cabin. I locked the door and closed the curtains, what little there were. I sat on the cot with my knife in my lap. I didn't know what else to do. That night was the worst. I left the generator off so the light wouldn't give me away. I kept the flashlight close. I lay awake most of the night. Around 1 a.m., I heard the soft crunch of pine needles. Footsteps, slow, getting closer. Then came a light tap on the window, just once. Not loud, just enough to make sure I heard it. I froze. I didn't breathe. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. I pointed the flashlight at the window but didn't turn it on. Another tap, this one lower on the glass. I stayed that way for over an hour, not moving. Eventually, the sounds stopped. When the sky started to lighten, I packed my stuff. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just threw everything into my bag and walked out to the Jeep. That's when I saw what was carved into the side of the cabin. There, just beside the door frame, scratched into the wood, was a single word. Stay. The letters were long and crooked, like made with a knife. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I got in the Jeep and drove. I didn't stop until I was back on pavement. Even then, I kept going until I hit the next town. I didn't report it. What would I say? No crime had happened. Just a stranger out in the woods. I didn't know if the cabin owner even knew. Maybe someone else had a key. Maybe the place had some local history. I didn't want to know. I went home. I tried to forget, but I kept thinking about that figure across the lake. The footprints, the tapping, the word carved into the wall. Weeks later, I checked the listing again. The cabin was still there, still listed. Same photos, same price, same description, but the reviews had changed. There were new ones now. One person said they left early because something felt off. Another said they heard footsteps outside at night. Someone else mentioned seeing a tall figure watching them from the trees. That's when I knew it wasn't just me. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Not alone. Not that deep. The knife is still on my nightstand. I keep it close, even though I'm back in the city. I don't think I was ever really in danger. Not exactly, but I think whoever was out there wanted something. Maybe just to watch, maybe to scare, or maybe they were just waiting for someone who would stay. Not me. I left, and I won't go back.